Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt a photograph watching you? I never believed in such nonsense until last autumn when the Charleston Heritage Gallery opened its new exhibition. Memento Vivere, a century of forgotten faces, was what drew me there on that rain-slicked October evening. The small gallery sat nestled between a bookstore and an antique shop on Church Street, its windows glowing amber against the gathering darkness. My shoes squeaked against the polished hardwood as I entered. The reception area was empty except for an elderly man behind a small desk who barely looked up as he took my ticket. "Last visitor of the day," he murmured, checking his pocket watch. "You have 45 minutes before closing." The gallery itself was a single long room with photographs arranged chronologically along both walls. Daguerreotypes from the 1840s gave way to cabinet cards, then gelatin silver prints from the early 20th century. Most depicted Charleston residents, families posed stiffly on porches, children clutching toys, women in elaborate dresses, men with stern expressions behind magnificent mustaches. I was alone in the gallery, which suited me perfectly. Since moving to Charleston 3 months ago for my research position at the University Archives, I'd grown accustomed to solitude. Preferred it, even. The quiet allowed me to notice details others might miss. Like the faint smell of lavender and tobacco that seemed to follow me through the exhibition. Old photographs often retain scents, I reasoned, though something about this particular combination made the hair on my arms stand on end. Halfway through the gallery, I stopped before a large photograph labeled Charleston Ladies Auxiliary, 1893. 12 women arranged in 2 rows, all wearing black dresses with high collars. Their faces were clear, well preserved. The caption noted that several prominent local families were represented, though no names were listed. I leaned closer, studying their expressions. Somber, as was customary for photographs of that era. No one smiled except, wait, the woman on the far right of the back row. I could have sworn she was frowning when I first looked. Now her lips curved upward in the slightest smile. I blinked, certain my eyes were playing tricks. Fascinating collection, isn't it? I startled at the voice beside me. A woman with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood examining the same photograph. I hadn't heard her approach. "Yes," I managed, though I thought I was the last visitor. "Oh, I'm not a visitor," she said without looking at me. "I'm Eleanor Winthrop. My family donated several of these photographs." She gestured toward the Ladies' Auxiliary portrait. "Including this one. My great-grandmother is in the back row." "The one on the far right?" I asked, pointing to the woman with the maybe smile. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "No. Third from the left." She studied me with sudden intensity. "Did you see something unusual about the woman on the right?" A chill skittered down my spine. "No. Just wondering about her expression." Eleanor seemed unconvinced. "These old photographs have their secrets. If you look at them long enough, sometimes they reveal things." She tapped the glass over the photograph lightly. "Margaret Thornfield. That's the woman on the right. They say she disappeared the day after this photograph was taken. Never found." My mouth went dry. "That's terrible." "Yes, though she's not the only one. Eleanor gestured vaguely toward other photographs. Charleston has its share of vanishings. The overhead lights flickered briefly, casting momentary shadows that seemed to dance across the photographs. I should continue, I said, uncomfortable with both the conversation and the sudden dimness of the gallery. Of course. Eleanor stepped aside. Take your time with each photograph. Really look at them. Some reveal themselves only to certain viewers. I moved on, though I felt her eyes following me. The remaining photographs seemed ordinary enough: a church congregation, dock workers, a family posed before their plantation home. Yet as I progressed, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The sensation of being observed intensified with each step. Near the end of the exhibition hung a particularly striking portrait of a young man in a naval uniform, circa 1910 according to its label. His eyes were unusually light, almost translucent against his dark features. The nameplate read only Lieutenant, Charleston Naval Yard. As I examined the photograph, the strangest thing happened. I could have sworn his head tilted slightly, as though he were trying to get a better look at me. I jerked backward, blinking rapidly. When I looked again, the portrait appeared normal. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small octagonal pin on his lapel that seemed to catch the light in an unnatural way. And behind him, barely visible in the shadowy background, a partial face that hadn't been there before, eyes peering over his shoulder. The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they stabilized, I glanced around for Eleanor, but found myself alone. The gallery had grown colder, and the silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool. I decided I'd seen enough. As I turned to leave, something made me look back at the naval officer's portrait. The frame was empty. Not the photograph. The entire frame contained nothing but a blank, yellowed backing board. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached it cautiously. The photograph had vanished completely, leaving behind only the small brass nameplate. A thud from somewhere behind me broke the silence. I spun around to find the gallery completely dark except for a single spotlight illuminating a photograph I hadn't noticed before: a group of people standing before the very gallery I was now in. And in the front row, wearing the same clothes I had on today, was me. I stumbled backward, my shoulder blades hitting the wall. My rational mind scrambled for explanations: a prank, a projection, a doctored image, but found none that made sense. The photograph looked aged, sepia tone like the others, yet there I stood among strangers from another time. The spotlight blinked out, plunging the gallery into darkness. Then, one by one, lights flickered back on, revealing the room as it had been before. The mysterious photograph had vanished, and the naval officer's portrait had returned to its frame, though his pose seemed slightly different, his body angled more toward me. "We'll be closing in 10 minutes, called the elderly attendant from the front desk, his voice echoing through the space. I needed fresh air. My temples throbbed as I hurried toward the exit, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead to avoid looking at any more photographs. Yet in my peripheral vision, I could sense movement within the frames, subtle shifts, heads turning to follow my retreat. At the reception desk, I paused. "Do you know a woman named Eleanor Winthrop? Silver hair, glasses?" She said her family donated photographs to the exhibition. The attendant frowned. "No, Eleanor Winthrop has donated to our collection, sir. And you've been the only visitor for the past hour." My mouth went dry. But she was just. I stopped myself. "Never mind. Thank you." Outside, the evening had fully transformed into night. Rain fell in a fine mist that clung to my face as I walked briskly down Church Street, trying to shake the unnerving experience from my mind. Street lamps cast pools of light on the wet cobblestones, and shopkeepers were closing up for the night. Normal, everyday activities that should have been reassuring. They weren't. Because in every window I passed, I caught reflections that didn't match the street behind me. Faces peering out, some from the photographs I'd just seen, watching me with curious intensity. I quickened my pace to a near run, not stopping until I reached my small rented apartment above a coffee shop on Queen Street. Once inside, I double-locked the door and drew all the curtains before collapsing into my desk chair. "You're being ridiculous," I told myself aloud. "Photographs don't change. People don't disappear from frames. You're tired and your imagination is overactive." To prove it to myself, I opened my laptop and searched for information about the Charleston Heritage Gallery. Their website showed upcoming exhibitions, visitor information, and a brief history, all perfectly ordinary. Nothing about living photographs or mysterious disappearances. I was about to close the browser when I noticed a small news item dated 3 weeks ago. Charleston Heritage Gallery receives anonymous donation of rare photographic collection. The article mentioned that the collection included several images thought lost during a fire at the Charleston Historical Society in 1936. An impulse made me check my own camera roll on my phone. I had taken no photographs at the gallery. They weren't permitted, but I often snapped pictures around Charleston for my research. I scrolled through recent images, architectural details, archival documents, my new apartment. And then, a photograph I had no memory of taking. The Ladies' Auxiliary of 1893. The exact same image from the gallery, down to the ornate frame. But in this version, the woman on the far right, Margaret Thornfield, the one who supposedly vanished, was looking directly at the camera with an expression of unmistakable terror. And her hand, which had been folded primly in her lap in the gallery version, was now raised as if reaching out of the photograph. I dropped my phone as if it had burned me. A soft tapping sound made me freeze. It came from my window, a gentle, rhythmic tap-tap-tap like fingernails against glass. But my apartment was on the second floor, with no balcony or fire escape outside that particular window. I remained perfectly still, listening as the tapping continued, then slowly transformed into a scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of something trying to get in. My curtains were drawn, but a faint shadow moved across them, the silhouette of what might have been a hand, fingers splayed. The scratching intensified. I grabbed my phone and keys and fled the apartment, taking the stairs 2 at a time down to the street. The coffee shop below was closed, the street nearly deserted except for a couple walking their dog half a block away. Looking up at my window, I saw nothing unusual, no figure, no movement behind the curtain. But I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I spent that night at a hotel downtown, sleeping fitfully and waking often from dreams of being trapped inside a photograph, people on the outside world staring at me as I silently screamed. Morning brought clarity and embarrassment. I'd let an art exhibition and an overactive imagination drag me from my own home. After checking out of the hotel, I walked back to my apartment under bright sunshine that made last night's fears seem absurd. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it, curtains drawn, laptop open on the desk. No sign of any disturbance. I felt foolish as I made coffee and opened the curtains to let in the light. But when I picked up my phone to check emails, the photograph of the Ladies' Auxiliary was still there. And now I noticed something else. In the background of the image, partially hidden in shadow, stood the naval officer from the other portrait. He wasn't there in the gallery version. And on closer inspection, I realized with growing horror that another figure had appeared in the photograph as well. Eleanor Winthrop, the woman who claimed her great-grandmother was in the picture. She stood behind the seated women, her modern appearance jarringly out of place in the 19th century setting. She was looking directly at me, her finger raised to her lips in a silencing gesture. I deleted the photograph and cleared my phone's cache for good measure. Then I did what any academic would do when faced with the inexplicable. I decided to research. The university library's archives section was quiet that Saturday morning. I requested materials related to photography in Charleston during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While waiting for the archival boxes, I used the library computer to search for information about Margaret Thornfield, the woman who supposedly disappeared after the Ladies' Auxiliary photograph. There wasn't much, just a single mention in an 1893 newspaper: local woman missing, Margaret Thornfield, age 29, failed to return home from a Ladies' Auxiliary meeting on Tuesday evening. Anyone with information should contact Sheriff Hollister. No follow-up articles appeared in subsequent issues, as if Margaret Thornfield had been forgotten as quickly as she vanished. The archival materials arrived: 3 boxes of photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters. I began methodically going through them, looking for any connection to the gallery exhibition or the specific photographs I had seen. In the second box, I found a slim folder labeled Photographic Anomalies, 1890 to 1920. Inside were letters from a Dr. William Blackwood, who described himself as an investigator of the unexplained. My heart nearly stopped when I read his first entry from 1895. The disappearance of subjects from their photographic representations continues to baffle conventional explanation. In the 2 years since the first recorded incident, M. Thornfield, 1893, 11 additional cases have been documented in Charleston alone. In each instance, the subject vanishes from both their physical location and from any photographic plate on which they were previously captured. The letter continued, detailing Dr. Blackwood's theory that certain photographic processes inadvertently created channels between our world and another. That photographs weren't just capturing light, but something more essential, something soul-like. And in rare cases, that something could be drawn through. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice the librarian approach until she spoke directly behind me. "Finding what you need?" she asked. I jumped, papers scattering. "Yes, thank you." She helped me gather the fallen documents, her fingers lingering on Dr. Blackwood's letter. Interesting reading choice. Not many people request these materials. Something in her tone made me look up sharply. The librarian was older, with a severe bun and rectangular glasses. Not Eleanor Winthrop, but something about her expression seemed familiar. "Just research for a paper," I said vaguely. "Of course." She straightened, adjusting her glasses. "You should visit the exhibition at the Heritage Gallery. They've recently acquired some relevant items." My pulse quickened. "I was just there yesterday." "Were you?" She smiled thinly. "Then you must have noticed how the collection speaks to certain viewers." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing between the tall shelves of books. I looked down at the scattered papers and noticed something I hadn't seen before, a photograph that had fallen from between the pages of Blackwood's notes. It showed the interior of what appeared to be a photographer's studio, with elaborate backdrops and a large camera on a tripod. Standing beside the camera was the naval officer from the gallery, and seated before the backdrop was Margaret Thornfield. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, Lieutenant James Harrington and subject, final image before incident. I quickly gathered my things, no longer feeling safe in the quiet library. As I slid the photograph back into the folder, I noticed it had changed. Now Eleanor Winthrop stood in the background of the studio, and the naval officer, Lieutenant Harrington, was looking directly at the camera with a smile that revealed too many teeth. And Margaret Thornfield's face had been replaced with mine. I left the library in a daze, my research forgotten. The sun had disappeared behind thick clouds, and a chill wind carried the scent of rain. I needed to talk to someone to make sense of what was happening, but who would believe me? I had only been in Charleston for 3 months. I barely knew anyone outside my department. There was only one person who might understand Eleanor Winthrop, if she existed. I returned to the Heritage Gallery, half expecting it to have vanished like the naval officer's photograph. But the small building stood as before, lights glowing behind its windows despite the closed sign hanging on the door. I knocked anyway, more insistently than I intended. After a long moment, the elderly attendant opened the door a crack. "We're closed for installation. New exhibition opens Monday." "I need to speak with Eleanor Winthrop," I said. "It's urgent." His face remained impassive. "No one by that name works here." "Please," I persisted. She told me her family donated photographs. The Ladies' Auxiliary portrait from 1893. Something flickered in his eyes. "Wait here." He closed the door. Minutes passed. I was about to leave when the door reopened. A different man stood there, younger, with a trimmed beard and anxious eyes. "I'm Daniel Greaves, the curator. Please come in." The gallery had been transformed. Most of the photographs from yesterday's exhibition had been removed, with only bare hooks on the walls. Staff members were carefully hanging new frames. Daniel led me to a small office at the back. "You mentioned Eleanor Winthrop and the Ladies' Auxiliary photograph." "Yes, I spoke with her here yesterday. She claimed her great-grandmother was in that photograph." He opened a drawer and removed a folder. "We have no record of an Eleanor Winthrop associated with our gallery or that photograph." "But the photograph itself, it was here? The Charleston Ladies' Auxiliary from 1893? "It was," he confirmed, "but it's been removed from the exhibition." He hesitated. "There was an incident." "What kind of incident?" Instead of answering, he removed a photograph from the folder. It was the Ladies' Auxiliary portrait I recognized, but something was wrong. 2 of the women in the back row were missing, leaving empty spaces where they had been, including Margaret Thornfield. "This happened overnight," Daniel said quietly. "The photograph was intact when we closed yesterday. This morning, 2 of the subjects had vanished from the image." My throat constricted. "And the naval officer's portrait?" His eyes widened. "Lieutenant Harrington? That photograph disappeared entirely. We found only an empty frame this morning." "You know his name," I whispered. The nameplate only said Lieutenant. Daniel's face paled. He closed the folder with trembling hands. "I think you should leave." "Please," I begged. "I need to understand what's happening. I've seen these photographs change. I've seen people from them." "Stop," he interrupted sharply. "You're in danger. We all are." He lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "They're listening. They're always listening when we talk about them." A chill ran through me. "Who's listening?" "The people in the photographs." He glanced nervously at the door. "Some of them weren't meant to be captured. And now they're finding ways out." "Out? Of the photographs?" He nodded grimly. It's happened before. 1893, 1910, 1936. Always in Charleston. Always starting with a disappearance and ending with, he cut himself off as a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. The door swung open. Eleanor Winthrop stood there, smiling pleasantly. "Ah, you've returned. I thought you might." Daniel went rigid. "Miss Cordell, this is a private conversation." Eleanor, or Miss Cordell, ignored him, her eyes fixed on me. "Have you noticed any changes? In yourself, I mean. Moments where you feel translucent? As if you might be fading?" My hand went instinctively to my face. "Who are you?" "I told you. Eleanor Winthrop. My family has a long history with these photographs." She entered the room fully, closing the door behind her. "Daniel knows. His grandfather was the photographer who tried to document what was happening in 1936. Daniel's jaw tightened. My grandfather disappeared along with his entire collection. Not disappeared, she corrected. Transposed. There's a difference. She turned to me. "You've seen the photograph of yourself, haven't you? The one you never took." I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "It's already starting for you," she continued. "First you appear in a photograph you never posed for. Then parts of you begin to fade here while becoming more solid there. Eventually, the transfer completes." "Transfer to where?" "I managed." Her smile widened. "To the other side of the lens, where we all wait." Daniel lunged for the door, but Eleanor was faster. She produced an antique box camera from her bag and pointed it at him. A blinding flash erupted from its lens. Daniel froze mid-motion, his expression locked in terror. Then, before my eyes, he began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less substantial, like a double-exposed photograph. "Daniel!" I cried, reaching for him. My hand passed through his arm. Eleanor turned the camera toward me. "Your turn." I dove behind the desk as another flash filled the room. The wall where I'd been standing darkened, as if burned. "You can't escape it," Eleanor called, her voice changing, deepening, acquiring an accent I couldn't place. "Once you've been seen, you become part of the collection." I crawled toward a second door at the back of the office. Behind me, Daniel had faded to little more than an outline. "We need new faces," Eleanor continued. "Fresh souls to keep the memories alive." I reached the door and yanked it open, finding myself in a narrow hallway lined with photographs I recognized from the exhibition. As I ran past, the subjects turned to watch me, eyes shifting, heads rotating, hands pressing against the glass as if testing its strength. At the end of the hallway was another door. I burst through it into what appeared to be a storage room filled with crates and bubble-wrap frames. There was no exit. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Eleanor's voice called out, no longer even attempting to sound human. It echoed and distorted as if coming from multiple throats simultaneously. "Do you know why photography was once considered a dark art? Because it steals souls. Fragments of essence captured in silver and light." I frantically searched for a weapon, a hiding place, anything. The only window was too small to climb through. The earliest photographers discovered it by accident. That sometimes the barrier between viewer and subject becomes permeable. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I backed against the far wall, surrounded by packaged photographs, feeling dozens of unseen eyes watching me. Lieutenant Harrington was the first to understand how to exploit it, how to exchange places with the living. He's been collecting ever since, building his gallery of souls. The door swung open. Eleanor stood there, but her appearance had changed. Her silver hair now had streaks of dark, her face younger in places, older in others, a composite of different women. Behind her spectral glasses, her eyes were those of the naval officer from the portrait. "Your camera," I said, noticing it was gone from her hands. "I don't need it anymore." She smiled with too many teeth. "You're already partly in the frame. Look." She held up her phone. On its screen was the mysterious photograph I'd seen in the gallery, the one showing me among strangers. Except now I was more defined than the others, standing in the foreground while they faded into the background. "No," I whispered. "Fight it if you wish," she said, advancing slowly. "The more you struggle, the more interesting the composition becomes." I felt it then, a pulling sensation, as if parts of me were being drawn toward the phone screen. My fingertips tingled, becoming transparent at the edges. "What do you want?" I gasped, fighting the sensation. "To be seen," the thing wearing Eleanor's composite face replied. "To be remembered. To live beyond our time, as all artists desire." I lunged for the shelves beside me, pulling down bubble-wrapped frames onto the floor between us. Glass shattered. The creature that had been Eleanor screamed, not in pain but in fury. "Those are mine. My collection." I grabbed a large shard of glass, ignoring the way it cut into my palm. The pain anchored me, made me feel solid again. "Stay back," I warned, brandishing the makeshift weapon. She laughed, the sound rippling through multiple voices. "You can't harm me with that. I'm already beyond physical injury." But her eyes, Harrington's eyes, tracked the glass shard with unmistakable concern. Understanding flooded me. I turned and began slashing at the wrapped photographs around us, tearing through protective coverings to expose the images beneath. "Stop," she shrieked, lunging forward. I slashed through a particularly large frame, revealing the full lady's auxiliary portrait. Without hesitation, I dragged the glass shard across it, cutting through the faces of the women in the image. Eleanor/Harrington convulsed as if physically wounded. The composite face rippled, features rearranging themselves in agony. "You're not beyond harm," I realized aloud. "You're bound to these images. They're your anchors to our world." I continued my destruction, slashing through photograph after photograph. With each one, the creature before me seemed to fragment further, its form becoming unstable. "You'll trap yourself," it howled, voice splintering. "Cut your ties and you'll have nowhere to return to." I paused, glass shard dripping blood. "What do you mean?" "You're already halfway across," it said, features settling momentarily into Lieutenant Harrington's face. "Destroy all the photographs and you'll be trapped between worlds. Neither here nor there. Forever." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with my free hand. The screen showed the photograph of me among strangers, but now I was fully solid while they had faded to near transparency. And I was no longer standing among them but moving away, toward the edge of the frame. Escaping. "You're lying," I told the creature. "You're trying to save yourself." Its face shifted again, cycling through features I recognized from the exhibition photographs. "We can share this power. The ability to move between worlds. To live forever." My phone buzzed again. The photograph had changed once more. I was now at the very edge of the frame, one foot seemingly stepping out of the image altogether. I made my decision. With a final desperate movement, I swept the glass shard across my phone screen, cutting through the digital image. The world exploded into blinding light and absolute darkness simultaneously. I awoke to the beeping of hospital monitors. Sunlight streamed through half-drawn blinds, illuminating a standard hospital room. My right hand was heavily bandaged and 4-line inserted in my left arm. A nurse entered, checking the monitors before noticing I was awake. "Welcome back," she said cheerfully. "You gave everyone quite a scare." My throat felt parched. "What happened?" "You were found unconscious in a storage room of the Heritage Gallery. Severe lacerations to your right hand, mild concussion." She adjusted something on the Ford drip. "The police want to speak with you when you're feeling up to it." "The police?" She nodded. "Breaking and entering, vandalism. Several valuable photographs were destroyed." Her expression turned curious. "You were saying some strange things when they brought you in. About people in photographs watching you." I remained silent, unsure what was real anymore. "Your doctor will be in shortly," she said, moving toward the door. "Oh, and you have a visitor waiting. A historian from the University Museum. Says she's a colleague." Before I could protest, the nurse left. Minutes later, a woman entered, middle-aged, with auburn hair and a notebook in hand. Not Eleanor. Not anyone I recognized. "I'm Victoria Mercer," she said, taking a seat beside the bed. "I curate the photographic collection at the University Museum." "I don't know you," I said wearily. "No, but I know about you." She opened her notebook. "3 days ago, you visited the Heritage Gallery. Yesterday, you were found in their storage room surrounded by destroyed photographs, including several rare pieces from the Harrington collection." My pulse quickened. "Harrington?" "Lieutenant James Harrington. A naval officer and amateur photographer from the early 1900s. She studied me intently. His collection was thought lost in the Historical Society fire of 1936, but apparently some pieces survived." "There's something wrong with those photographs," I said, my voice low. "They change. The people in them move." Victoria didn't look surprised. "You're not the first to claim this." She withdrew a folded newspaper article from her notebook and placed it on my blanket. "This might interest you." It was a yellow clipping from 1936. The headline read, "Local photographer missing after disturbance at Historical Society." The article described how Daniel Greaves Sr. had been working late cataloging photographs when staff heard shouts and breaking glass. When they investigated, they found several damaged photographs and no sign of Greaves except his camera. "Daniel Greaves," I whispered. "I met his grandson." Victoria nodded. "The current curator at the Heritage Gallery. Though I checked this morning, and there is no Daniel Greaves currently employed there." A chill ran through me. He was there. I saw him fade away when the thing that called itself Eleanor Winthrop used a camera on him. Victoria remained calm, making notes. Eleanor Winthrop is another interesting figure. According to records, she was reported missing in 1911 after visiting a photographic exhibition at the Charleston Library. Her case was never solved. The room seemed to tilt around me. She's one of them. Trapped in the photographs. Or working with them. With who? Lieutenant Harrington. He's found a way to exchange places with people. to pull them into photographs while he escapes. Victoria set down her pen. Do you have any proof of these claims? My phone, I said suddenly. There was a photograph on my phone that I never took. It showed me among strangers, as if I was being pulled into their world. She reached into her bag and produced my phone in a clear evidence bag. The police recovered this. It's damaged, the screen is cracked, but it still functions. I took it with trembling fingers. The screen was indeed cracked, a deep gash running diagonally across it. I navigated to my photo gallery. The mysterious photograph was gone. It was here, I insisted. A group of people, and me among them, even though I never posed for it. I believe you, Victoria said quietly. I looked up, startled. You do? She nodded. Because I've spent 20 years researching what I call transitional photography, images that serve as doorways between states of being. She took back my phone, examining the cracked screen. The glass barrier is symbolic as well as literal. When you broke it, you may have severed the connection. Who are you really? I asked, suddenly suspicious. Victoria smiled faintly. Someone who narrowly escaped what you experienced. Portland, 12 years ago. A different collection, but the same phenomenon. She rolled up her sleeve to reveal a jagged scar running the length of her forearm. My souvenir from breaking my own photographic prison. Relief flooded through me, someone who understood, who believed me. What happens now? I asked. Now we make sure you're fully anchored in this reality. She reached into her bag again and produced a small digital camera. I need to take your photograph. I recoiled instinctively. No cameras. Trust me, she said. A new, clean image helps overwrite the transitional one. It strengthens your connection to this world. Reluctantly, I nodded. Victoria raised the camera. Wait, I said. How do I know you're not one of them? She lowered the camera slightly. You don't. That's the nature of trust. She raised it again. Ready? I had no choice. I nodded. The flash momentarily blinded me. When my vision cleared, Victoria was reviewing the image on the camera's display. She turned it toward me. The photograph showed me in the hospital bed, looking pale but solid. Completely normal. See? Just a regular photograph. She turned off the camera and returned it to her bag. The Heritage Gallery is closing its photography exhibition early, by the way. Too many complaints about curatorial inconsistencies, photographs not matching their descriptions, images appearing to change overnight. Will it stop? Now that I destroyed some of the photographs? Victoria's expression grew serious. You didn't destroy all of them. And Lieutenant Harrington has had over a century to build his collection, to spread his influence. He wants to be remembered, I said, recalling the creature's words. To live beyond his time. Don't we all? Victoria stood. Rest now. I'll return tomorrow. We have much to discuss about protecting yourself and identifying others who may have been replaced. After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling, processing everything that had happened. The nurse returned with medication, which I gratefully accepted. As sleep began to overtake me, I noticed something on the small table beside my bed, a business card Victoria must have left behind. I reached for it with my unbandaged hand. The card was elegant, minimalist. Victoria Mercer, photographic preservation specialist. Below that, a phone number and an address in the historic district. And in the corner, a small emblem I recognized with a jolt of horror, an octagonal pin identical to the one worn by Lieutenant Harrington in his portrait. I tried to sit up, to call for the nurse, but the medication had already taken effect. My limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was a text message lighting up my cracked phone screen. Smile for the camera. We're not finished with you yet. 2 weeks later, the Charleston Heritage Gallery reopened with a new exhibition, Liminal Spaces, Portraits on the Threshold. The centerpiece was a striking photograph of a hospital room with a patient sleeping peacefully while a female visitor stood watching over them. Visitors who lingered before this photograph sometimes reported a curious phenomenon. If they looked long enough, the sleeping patient's eyes would slowly open, staring directly out of the frame with an expression of desperate warning. And the visitor standing beside the bed would gradually turn toward the viewer, her features shifting subtly to reveal a familiar naval officer's smile. The photograph bore no artist's name, only a small brass plate with an inscription. Captured Moments, the Victoria Mercer Collection, acquired 2025. One evening, a university student researching local folklore visited the exhibition. He spent an unusually long time before the hospital room photograph, taking notes with increasing agitation. The gallery attendant found him particularly odd, especially when he asked if anyone named Eleanor Winthrop had ever been associated with the gallery. As closing time approached, the student remained fixated on the photograph. The attendant finally approached him. "We're closing soon, sir." The young man startled. "Sorry, this photograph." The patient in the bed. "I know him." "Really?" the attendant asked politely. "That's quite impossible. These photographs are all vintage pieces." "No," the student insisted. "He was my professor last semester. Then he disappeared 3 weeks ago. No one seems to remember him clearly, but I do." The attendant's expression changed subtly. "How interesting. Perhaps you'd like to see our special collection? We have more photographs from this series in storage." "Yes," the student said eagerly. "I need to understand what happened to him." "Of course you do," the attendant replied, her eyes momentarily reflecting the gallery lights with an unnatural gleam. "Everyone deserves to be remembered properly." She locked the front door and led him toward the back of the gallery. As they walked, the figures in the photographs along the walls turned in unison to watch their passage. "I have a feeling you'll be perfect for our collection," the attendant said, her voice deepening slightly as she removed an antique camera from beneath the reception desk. "We always need fresh perspectives." The student never returned to campus that night. A week later, a new photograph appeared in the exhibition, a young man standing in the gallery, his expression one of dying horror as he stared at something beyond the frame. And in the hospital room photograph beside it, the patient in the bed had changed position slightly. He now lay with his back to the viewer, face hidden, as if he could no longer bear to watch what was happening. In time, visitors stopped noticing anything unusual about the photographs. The gallery's reputation grew as a hidden gem of Charleston's art scene, especially popular among tourists seeking authentic local culture. Few ever realized that with each visit, they left behind something essential, fragments of themselves captured in silver and light, collected by patient eyes that had waited decades for new faces to remember, new souls to preserve. And if sometimes, walking past the gallery windows after dark, passers-by glimpsed unfamiliar reflections moving independently of their owners, well, that was just another strange tale to add to Charleston's rich tapestry of ghost stories. Just another curiosity in the city's panopticon of whispers. What if the places we trust most are the ones we should fear? The fluorescent lights of Denver Value Mart buzzed overhead as I pushed my shopping cart through the nearly empty aisles. My watch read 11:45, 15 minutes until closing. I hadn't planned to shop this late, but after working overtime at the hospital, I needed to restock my empty refrigerator. Most people avoided late-night shopping after the news reports. 3 disappearances in the past month, all from this store's underground parking garage. The police had increased patrols, the store had added security cameras, but still no leads. Management insisted the store was safe, but customer traffic had noticeably declined after dark. I should have ordered groceries online like my roommate suggested, but here I was, one of only 4 customers left in the store. The overhead speakers crackled with the announcement that the store would be closing in 15 minutes. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, making me jump despite myself. "Just grab what you need and go," I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the slight tremor in my hands. I wasn't normally anxious, but something about the emptiness of the store made my skin prickle. Each squeak of my cart's wheels seemed to amplify in the silence. I hurried through my mental checklist: milk, eggs, bread, coffee, the essentials. As I rounded the corner to the dairy section, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned, there was nothing there, just the empty aisle stretching behind me. "Get it together, Alex," I muttered. Working night shifts as a nurse had me seeing things. That was all. Just exhaustion playing tricks. A store employee, his name tag read Miguel, was restocking the dairy case. He nodded at me with a tight smile. "Finding everything okay?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet for a customer service interaction. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, reaching for a carton of milk. "Pretty quiet tonight." Miguel glanced around before leaning slightly closer. "Most people don't come in this late anymore." "Not since." He trailed off, busying himself with arranging yogurt containers. "The disappearances, I finished for him." He nodded without looking up. "Security's been increased, but..." He shrugged. "Just be careful in the garage, okay? Don't linger." His warning sent a chill through me. "Have you seen anything unusual around here?" Miguel paused. "Sometimes the lights flicker down there." And he stopped abruptly as another employee walked by. "It's probably nothing. Just get to your car quickly." The overhead speakers announced 10 minutes until closing. I thanked Miguel and hurried to finish my shopping, suddenly eager to leave despite the dread I felt about entering the parking garage. At checkout, a bored-looking cashier named Tina scanned my items with mechanical efficiency. Through the store's front windows, I could see rain had started to fall, streaking the glass and blurring the distant city lights. "Would you like help out to your car?" she asked, reciting the standard offer without enthusiasm. "No, thanks. I can manage," I replied quickly, swiping my credit card. As I pushed my cart toward the elevator that led to the underground parking, I felt a strange reluctance growing with each step. The store's brightness and the presence of other humans, however few, felt suddenly precious. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Empty. I stepped inside with my cart and pressed P2, the lower level where I parked. As the doors closed, cutting off the store's fluorescent glow, I felt my heart rate increase. The descent seemed to take longer than I remembered. When the doors opened again, I was greeted by the concrete expanse of the parking garage. The air was different down here, cooler, damper, with that distinctive mix of exhaust and stale air. The overhead lights cast yellowish pools at regular intervals, but between them lay patches of shadow. I pushed my cart forward, the wheels echoing loudly against the concrete. My car was parked near the far wall, maybe 50 yards away. Not far. I could make it in less than a minute. But something felt wrong. The usual background hum of the ventilation system seemed to stutter and fade, replaced by a peculiar silence. My footsteps and the cart's wheels were the only sounds until I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like shoes dragging slowly across concrete, coming from somewhere behind me. I quickened my pace, not daring to look back. The sound stopped. When I paused, it stopped too. When I moved, after a moment's delay, it resumed. Someone was matching my pace. The distance to my car seemed to stretch impossibly. The lights overhead flickered once, twice. In those milliseconds of darkness, I thought I saw a figure reflected in my car's window, tall, unnaturally still, standing just beyond the reach of the nearest light pole. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them as I reached my car. The parking garage had emptied out. Only 3 other vehicles remained scattered across the vast space. I opened my trunk with shaking hands and began throwing grocery bags inside, no longer caring about crushing the bread or bruising the fruit. That's when the overhead lights flickered again, longer this time. In the momentary darkness, I felt rather than saw movement nearby. A displacement of air. A presence. When the lights stabilized, I slammed my trunk shut and practically threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. My breathing came in short, panic bursts as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice before roaring to life. In my rearview mirror, I saw nothing but empty parking spaces and concrete pillars. But as I pulled out and drove toward the exit ramp, the overhead lights began to flicker in sequence as if following my car's path. And in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of where the light met shadow, I thought I saw a figure standing perfectly still, face obscured, watching as I drove away. I didn't slow down until I reached the street level, where the rain and city lights washed away the garage's oppressive atmosphere. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my shirt damp with cold sweat. It was nothing, I told myself. Just anxiety fueled by those news reports. Just my imagination working overtime after too many night shifts and not enough sleep. But as I drove home through the rain-slicked streets, one question kept repeating in my mind. Why had the figure in the parking garage seemed to be wearing the same uniform as the Denver Value Mart employees? I couldn't stop thinking about what happened at the supermarket. 3 days passed, and I'd been ordering takeout rather than face that parking garage again. But my refrigerator was now truly barren, and my bank account couldn't handle another night of delivery fees. "You're being ridiculous," I told my reflection as I grabbed my keys. It was 7:30 in the evening, still light outside, still busy at the store. Safe. Denver Value Mart looked different in the early evening. Families pushed carts through crowded aisles, children whined for candy, music played overhead. Normal. I filled my cart methodically, taking comfort in the mundane activity and the presence of so many people. As I passed the dairy section, I spotted Miguel stocking yogurt, just as he had been that night. He looked up as I approached, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're back," he said, sounding surprised. "Needed groceries," I replied with a shrug I hoped to appear casual. "Seems busier tonight." Miguel nodded. "Always is before 8. After that." He trailed off, glancing around before continuing in a lower voice. They found another car yesterday. Empty, keys still in the ignition. Fourth one this month. My stomach tightened. Was it on the news? I haven't heard anything. Management's keeping it quiet. Worried about business. He arranged yogurt containers with unusual precision. Police were here all morning. They think it might be someone who works here. An employee? The image of the uniformed figure I glimpsed flashed in my mind. That's the theory. Or someone who knows the security blind spots. Miguel hesitated. Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but the cameras on level P2 keep malfunctioning. Every time someone disappears, there's mysterious interference, static, then nothing. A mother with 2 children pushed her cart between us, momentarily breaking our conversation. When she passed, Miguel leaned closer. Whatever you do, don't park on P2. That's where they all vanished from. I swallowed hard. Thanks for the warning. He nodded and returned to his work, but called after me as I turned to leave. If you're still here after dark, ask for an escort to your car. We've doubled up security now. I finished my shopping quickly, making sure to check out well before the store's 9 o'clock closing time. The sun was setting as I loaded my groceries into my trunk, casting long shadows across the above-ground parking lot. No flickering lights, no mysterious figures. Just an ordinary evening. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt drawn back inside, compelled by something I couldn't name. Before I could question the impulse, I found myself walking back toward the store entrance. The security guard at the door gave me a curious look. Forget something? Just wanted to use the restroom before heading home, I lied smoothly. Inside, I bypassed the restrooms and headed straight for the customer service desk, where a young woman with dyed purple hair was sorting through return items. Excuse me, I said. I'm a nurse at Denver General. I heard there have been incidents here, and I'm wondering if the missing people had anything in common? Any pattern that might help identify who's at risk? Her eyes widened slightly. I'm not supposed to talk about that, she whispered, looking around nervously. Management says it'll cause panic. I understand, but I'm concerned about public safety. Maybe I could help. She hesitated, then leaned forward. They were all alone. All had large grocery orders, like they were stocking up. And all of them. She paused, looking troubled. All of them had visited the store multiple times that week. Like they were being watched, selected. Something cold settled in my stomach. I'd been here late at night just 3 days ago. And now I was back. Thank you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. One more thing, do you have security footage from the garage? Police took copies, but yeah, there's a monitoring room. She gestured toward a door marked employees only near the manager's office. Not that it helps much. The cameras keep glitching. I thanked her and walked away, pretending to head toward the exit but veering into the home goods aisle once out of sight. My heart pounded as I contemplated what I was about to do. This was stupid, dangerously stupid. I should leave, call the police with my suspicions, let professionals handle it. Instead, I found myself lingering, pretending to browse kitchen gadgets until I spotted a staff-only door propped slightly open by a mop bucket. A janitor emerged, pushing his cleaning cart toward the public restrooms. Before I could reconsider, I slipped through the door into a bare, fluorescent-lit hallway. The employee break room was empty, a half-eaten sandwich abandoned on the table. Beyond it lay another corridor with several doors, one labeled security. I approached cautiously, listening for sounds of movement inside. Hearing nothing, I tried the handle. Locked. Of course it would be locked. Just as I was about to retreat, I heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. Panicking, I ducked into the nearest open doorway, a cramped supply closet filled with cleaning products and paper goods. Through the crack in the door, I watched a security guard walk past, jangling his keys. Then another figure appeared, the store manager, judging by his suit and name badge. They stopped just outside my hiding place. Fourth one this month, the manager was saying, his voice tense. Police are asking questions about employee schedules, access codes. What did you tell them? The guard asked. That our systems are secure. That we've had no unauthorized access. He sounded defensive. The last thing we need is for people to think it's one of our own. The guard sighed. But the timing, sir. Always just before closing, always on P2. It has to be someone who knows the system. Keep this quiet, the manager snapped. If word gets out that our security has been compromised, we're finished. They moved away, their voices fading. I waited, heart hammering, before slipping out of the closet and hurrying back toward the public area of the store. As I passed the security door again, I noticed something, a small window next to it, partially covered by a blind. Through the gap, I could see monitors showing different areas of the store and parking garage. Most displayed normal activity, customers shopping, cars coming and going. But one monitor, labeled P2 East, showed only static. I made my way back to the sales floor, trying to appear casual despite my racing thoughts. The store would be closing in 30 minutes. Already the number of shoppers had dwindled significantly. At the exit, I paused. The smart move would be to leave now, call the police from the safety of my car. But what would I tell them? That I had a hunch? That I'd spied on a private conversation? No, I needed evidence. Something concrete. And I had an idea how to get it. I turned back, heading for the electronics department. If the security cameras were being tampered with, I needed my own recording device. I purchased a small dash cam with night vision capability and a portable power bank. Not ideal, but it might capture what the store's cameras couldn't. By the time I finished checking out, the closing announcement was playing overhead. Most shoppers had already left. I approached Miguel, who was finishing his shift at the customer service desk. I need a favor, I said quietly. Can you tell me how to access the lower level of the parking garage without using the main elevator? I'm worried someone might be watching it. Miguel stared at me. Why would you want to go down there now? I think I saw something the other night. Something the cameras missed. He hesitated, then wrote something on a piece of paper. There's a service elevator by the loading docks. This is the code. But you'd be crazy to go down there alone. I'll be careful, I promised, pocketing the paper. And if I'm not back in 20 minutes, call the police. Before he could protest further, I walked away, heading toward the back of the store. The service elevator was where he said it would be, tucked away in a corner near the receiving area. I punched in the code with trembling fingers. The doors slid open, revealing a bare, utilitarian car large enough for pallets of merchandise. I stepped inside, pressing the button for P2. As the doors closed, cutting me off from the safety of the store above, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The elevator descended with a low mechanical hum. I set up the dash cam, positioning it to record through the bottom of my shirt. Not exactly FBI level surveillance, but it would have to do. When the doors opened, I was met with the same concrete expanse I'd fled 3 nights ago. But this time, I was prepared. Or so I thought. I moved cautiously into the parking area. It was nearly empty now, just a few cars scattered across the vast space. The overhead lights cast the same yellowish pools, leaving pockets of shadow between them. I made my way toward the eastern section, where the security camera showed only static. The air felt colder here, damper. My footsteps echoed against the concrete, impossibly loud in the silence. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a subtle wrongness underlying the usual garage odors of exhaust and damp concrete. Something metallic. Something organic. The lights flickered once, twice, before stabilizing again. In those brief moments of darkness, I thought I heard movement. A soft scraping sound, like before. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. Had I imagined it? Then I saw something on the ground near one of the support pillars. Dark splotches, almost invisible against the gray concrete. I knelt down, touching one cautiously. It was sticky, partially dried. Blood. I stood quickly, heart pounding. The dash cam. I needed to make sure it was capturing this. As I reached to adjust it, the overhead lights flickered again, longer this time. In the darkness, I sensed rather than saw movement behind me. When the lights came back on, I spun around. There was nothing there. But the scraping sound had returned, closer now, coming from beyond the nearest row of cars. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. Security? No response. Just that terrible scraping, growing louder. I began backing toward the elevator, keeping my eyes on the shadows between the parked cars. The lights flickered again, on, off, in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. And then I saw it. In the brief moments of darkness, a figure stood at the edge of the nearest light pool. When the lights came back on, there was nothing there. But with each flicker, it seemed to be closer. I turned and ran, no longer caring about evidence or investigation. The elevator was 30 yards away. 20. The lights continued their strobing, and in the darkness between flashes, I could hear footsteps running behind me. I reached the elevator, jabbing desperately at the call button. The doors slid open with agonizing slowness. I threw myself inside, hammering the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of something in the final flicker of the overhead lights. A figure in a Denver Value Mart uniform, face obscured by shadow, moving with a jerking, unnatural gait. Then the doors closed, and I was alone in the sudden brightness of the elevator car, gasping for breath, the dash cam still recording beneath my shirt. Whatever was happening in that garage, I now had evidence. But as the elevator rose toward the safety of the ground floor, one question haunted me. Had I just recorded a human predator at work, or something else entirely? The police didn't believe me. "So you're saying you trespassed in a restricted area to conduct your own investigation?" Detective Ramirez looked unimpressed as she reviewed my statement. We sat in a small interview room at the precinct where I'd gone straight from the supermarket. "I saw blood on the floor," I insisted. "And someone was following me. It's all on the dash cam recording." Detective Ramirez sighed, pushing the camera across the desk. "We reviewed the footage, Mr. Chen. There's nothing there but you walking around an empty parking garage. No blood, no mysterious figure. That's impossible. I grabbed the camera, rewinding to play it back. My hands froze as I watched. She was right. The footage showed only concrete floors, parked cars, and me moving nervously between them. No blood splotches. No shadowy figures. Even the flickering lights appeared normal. But I saw it, I whispered. I felt it there with me. 4 people have gone missing, Ramirez said, her voice softening slightly. We understand your concern. But we need facts, not amateur detective work based on rumors. What about the employee who told me the security cameras keep malfunctioning? Or the conversation I overheard between the manager and security guard? We're investigating all angles, she replied diplomatically. In the meantime, I strongly advise you to leave this to professionals. I left the station feeling frustrated and vaguely embarrassed. Had I imagined everything? The blood, the figure, the unnatural movement? Lack of sleep combined with anxiety could cause hallucinations. As a nurse, I knew this. But something still felt wrong. I spent the next day researching the previous disappearances. All 4 victims had vanished from the same parking garage. All had been shopping alone late in the evening. Police had found their abandoned cars, but no signs of struggle, no evidence of what happened to them. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flickering lights of the garage, heard that scraping sound coming closer. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up and opened my laptop, navigating to the Denver Value Mart website. Their About Us page featured a timeline of the store's history. Founded in 1988, expanded to 3 locations by 1995, completed renovation of flagship store in 2008. I paused at a photograph showing the grand reopening after renovation. Something about the building looked different. I pulled up current images of the store for comparison. The structure was largely the same, but in the older photo, there appeared to be only 1 level of underground parking. When had they added the 2nd level? And why? I dug deeper, searching news archives for information about the renovation. Most articles focused on the expanded retail space and modernized facilities, but one small piece in the business section of the Denver Post caught my attention. Denver Value Mart expansion faces delays after construction incident. According to the article, dated March 2007, excavation for the 2nd parking level had been temporarily halted after workers breached what appeared to be an old mine shaft. 2 construction workers had been injured, though details were sparse. Denver's history with mining was well documented. The city had been founded during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and abandoned mines and tunnels honeycombed the surrounding areas. Most had been mapped and sealed, but occasionally, urban development uncovered forgotten passages. Had this supermarket been built over one of these old mines? And more importantly, had they properly sealed it before completing the 2nd parking level? I was still researching when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Denver Value Mart. My heart skipped as I answered. Hello? It's Miguel. His voice was hushed, urgent. Are you okay? I heard you went back down to P2 last night. How did you know that? Word spreads fast here. The manager's furious, says you were trespassing, messing with the investigation. He paused. Did you find anything? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Maybe. The dash cam didn't record what I saw, but I know something's wrong down there. Did you know the store was built over an old mine shaft? Silence stretched for several seconds. There are rumors, Miguel finally said. Older employees talk about strange noises during construction. Some refuse to work closing shifts. He lowered his voice further. Listen, I found something. An incident report from when they were digging out P2. It mentions unusual findings and historical remains. What kind of remains? It doesn't specify. But after that, the construction company quit. Denver Valley U-Mart had to bring in someone new to finish the job. He took a shaky breath. I think they found something down there, something they covered up instead of properly dealing with. How can I see this report? You can't. I only saw it because I was filing paperwork in the manager's office. He hesitated. But I can help you get back down there. After what happened to Lisa, I want answers too. Lisa? The cashier who disappeared 2 weeks ago. She was my friend. His voice cracked slightly. The police think she just walked off, but her car was still here. Her purse was in her locker. She wouldn't just leave. We arranged to meet that evening. Miguel would be working the closing shift and could let me in through the loading dock after hours. It was risky, possibly illegal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in that garage, something the authorities either couldn't see or chose to ignore. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I bought a more sophisticated camera with enhanced night vision capabilities, a powerful flashlight, and a small digital audio recorder. If something was hiding in the shadows, I would capture it this time. I also took a precaution the logical part of my brain found ridiculous. I tucked a small iron railroad spike into my pocket. If the legends were true and old mines harbored more than just darkness, iron was supposedly a protection. Superstitious nonsense, perhaps, but it couldn't hurt. At 11:30 that night, I parked a block away from Denver Valley U-Mart and approached on foot. The store had closed at 9, and the parking lot was empty except for a few employee vehicles. I circled around to the loading dock as planned. Miguel was waiting, nervously scanning the area. He let me in quickly, closing the door behind us. Security does rounds every hour, he whispered. We have about 40 minutes before the next one. I've disabled the camera in the service elevator, but we need to be quick. We moved through the darkened store, past silent checkout lanes and shadowy aisles. With only emergency lighting active, the familiar space felt alien and threatening. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the polished floors. The elevator code changed after your last visit, Miguel said, punching in a new sequence. Management suspected an inside job with the disappearances. They're not wrong, I replied. But I don't think it's an employee, at least, not a living one. Miguel shot me a questioning look as the elevator doors opened. What does that mean? I hesitated, reluctant to voice my growing suspicion. Just a theory. Let's see what we find first. The descent to P2 felt longer than before. I activated my camera and audio recorder, determined to document whatever we encountered. Miguel fidgeted beside me, his earlier confidence visibly waning. What exactly are we looking for? He asked. Evidence, I replied. Blood, personal items from the missing people, signs of where they might have been taken. And if we find the person responsible, we get out and call the police. We're here for evidence, not confrontation. The elevator chimed softly as we reached P2. The doors slid open, revealing the now familiar concrete expanse. The yellowish lights created the same pools of illumination amid stretches of shadow. We stepped out cautiously. The garage appeared empty, with only 3 vehicles remaining, presumably belonging to the night security staff and cleaners. "This way," I said, leading toward the eastern section where I'd seen the blood splotches. "Stay close and keep recording." We moved slowly, every sense alert for danger. The air felt different down here, heavier, with that same underlying metallic smell I'd noticed before. "Do you smell that?" I whispered. Miguel nodded. "Like copper. Or old pennies." As we approached the area where I'd seen the blood, the overhead lights began to flicker, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Miguel grabbed my arm. "That's not normal," he hissed. "The new system shouldn't do that." I shone my flashlight on the floor, sweeping it across the concrete. Nothing. No blood splotches, no signs of disturbance. Had I imagined them after all? Then Miguel pointed to a support pillar. "Look at that." A thin, dark line ran down the concrete column, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. I touched it cautiously. The substance was tacky, partially dried. "Blood. This is it," I whispered. "This is what I saw before." We followed the trail, which led toward a maintenance door set into the concrete wall. It was marked electrical access authorized personnel only. "Does this connect to the old mine shaft?" I asked. Miguel shook his head. "I don't know. The building plans don't show anything beyond this wall." I tried the handle. Locked. But as I examined it more closely, I noticed scratch marks around the keyhole, as if someone had forced it open repeatedly. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the momentary darkness, I heard it, that soft scraping sound, coming from somewhere behind us. When the lights returned, we both spun around. The garage appeared empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. "We need to get this door open," I said urgently. Miguel produced a key ring. "Maintenance keys." I borrowed them from the janitor's office. He tried several before finding one that fit. The lock turned with a reluctant click. I pushed the door open slowly, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond. A narrow utility corridor stretched before us, lined with electrical conduits and water pipes. The air that rushed out was noticeably colder, carrying a stale, earthy smell like upturned soil and wet stone. "This doesn't look like a standard utility corridor," Miguel whispered. He was right. Beyond the initial section, the passage changed character. The concrete floor gave way to packed earth. The walls, while partially reinforced with modern materials, revealed sections of natural stone. "They built right over it," I breathed. "They found the mine shaft and just incorporated it into the structure." We advanced cautiously, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The passage descended gradually, the modern elements giving way to older construction, timber supports darkened with age, narrow-gauge rail tracks embedded in the floor. "This is definitely part of an old mine," Miguel said, his voice tight with anxiety. "How far does it go?" Before I could answer, the lights in the parking garage behind us went out completely. The only illumination now came from our flashlights. And in that darkness, we heard it clearly, the scraping sound, closer now, moving toward the open maintenance door. "Something's coming," Miguel hissed. "We need to hide." "No," I said, feeling a strange certainty. "We need to go deeper. Find where it takes them." The scraping grew louder. Whatever made that sound was approaching the utility corridor. Making a split-second decision, I pulled Miguel further into the passage, moving away from the entrance. The tunnel branched after about 50 yards. One path continued to descend, while another curved back toward what I assumed was the foundation of the supermarket. "Which way?" Miguel whispered. I shone my flashlight on the ground. The layer of dust covering the floor was disturbed along the descending path, multiple sets of footprints visible in the beam. "Down," I replied. "That's where it takes them." We followed the descending tunnel, which grew increasingly narrow and rough. The air became damper, the earthy smell stronger. Water dripped somewhere ahead, the sound echoing in the confined space. After what felt like hundreds of yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far wall, suggesting significant size. "What is this place?" Miguel breathed. I swept my light across the space, revealing the rusted remains of mining equipment or carts, picks, shovels. But it was what lay beyond these artifacts that froze the blood in my veins. In the center of the chamber stood a crude altar of stacked stone. Around it, arranged in a semicircle, were 5 chairs, ordinary plastic chairs like those from the supermarket break room. 4 of the chairs were occupied. 4 figures sat unnaturally still, heads slumped forward. Their clothes, everyday shopping attire, were stained with dark streaks. Their faces were hidden in shadow. "Oh God," Miguel whispered. "Is that?" "The missing people," I confirmed, my voice barely audible. We approached cautiously, every instinct screaming to run. As we got closer, I directed my flashlight beam at the nearest figure, a middle-aged man in a business suit, his grocery list still clutched in one lifeless hand. But it was his face that caused Miguel to stifle a scream. The man's eyes were open but clouded, his skin gray and waxy like a department store mannequin. His expression was frozen in a mask of terror. All 4 victims showed the same condition, positioned like macabre dolls around the stone altar. "They're dead," Miguel choked out. "All of them?" "No," I said, noticing a subtle movement, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of their chests. "They're breathing. But something's been done to them." On the altar lay a collection of personal items, wallets, phones, car keys, jewelry. Offerings arranged with disturbing precision. And behind the altar, carved into the rock wall, was a symbol, a spiral pattern surrounding a stylized eye. It looked ancient, predating the mining operation, perhaps even the settlement of Denver itself. "We need to get these people out of here," I said, reaching for the nearest victim. "I wouldn't do that." The voice came from behind us, familiar yet distorted. We spun around, flashlights revealing a figure standing at the chamber entrance. It was the store manager, still wearing his suit and name badge. But something was terribly wrong with his movements, jerky, puppet-like, as if his limbs were being controlled by unseen strings. "They're not ready to leave," he said, his voice fluctuating between his normal tone and something deeper, resonant in the chamber. "Neither are you." He stepped forward, and in the beam of our flashlights, I could see his eyes, clouded like those of the seated victims, yet somehow aware. Whatever was looking at us through those eyes wasn't the manager anymore. "What did you do to them?" I demanded, positioning myself between the figure and Miguel. "We preserved them," the thing wearing the manager's body replied. "As we have preserved many before. As we will preserve you." "We?" Miguel whispered. The manager's face contorted into an unnatural smile. "The old ones. Those who dwelled in darkness long before your kind built above. When your machines broke through, we found a way back to the surface." I felt something cold press against my leg, Miguel passing me something. The iron railroad spike I brought. I gripped it tightly in my pocket. "You're using the manager to kidnap people," I said, trying to keep the thing's attention on me as Miguel slowly edged toward the tunnel entrance. "We use many vessels," it replied. "The one who stocks shelves. The one who guards. The one who cleans. All serve when needed." The manager's head tilted at an impossible angle. "Your friend cannot escape. Others wait above." As if on cue, we heard movement in the tunnel, that same scraping sound, growing louder. The manager took another step forward. "You saw too much. Noticed too much. But you will serve us well." As the manager advanced, I gripped the iron spike tighter. My medical training told me this was impossible. People couldn't be controlled like puppets, couldn't survive in a catatonic state for weeks. Yet the evidence stood before me. "What are you?" I demanded, buying time as I assessed our options. The thing wearing the manager smiled with too many teeth. "We are the Forgotten. When the earth was broken for gold and silver, we were disturbed. When light came to our domain, we retreated. But we never left." Miguel edged closer to me, his voice a terrified whisper. "Alex, we need to run." "You cannot outrun us," the manager said, head snapping toward Miguel with mechanical precision. "The darkness is our domain. The light merely inconveniences us." The scraping sounds from the tunnel grew louder, multiple sets now, approaching from different directions. I made a split-second decision, lunging forward with the iron spike aimed at the manager's chest. His movements were unnaturally fast, but also strangely mechanical. He dodged partially, the spike grazing his arm instead. He howled, not in pain but in rage, the sound echoing with multiple voices. Where the iron had touched him, his skin sizzled and smoked. "The old metal burns," he hissed, backing away slightly. "You know more than you should. Run." I shouted to Miguel, pointing toward a second tunnel I'd spotted on the far side of the chamber. "Go!" We bolted across the chamber, past the seated victims and the altar. Behind us, the manager let out another inhuman howl, summoning his allies from the tunnels. The passage we entered was narrower, rougher, clearly part of the original mine rather than the modified section beneath the supermarket. Our flashlight beams bounced wildly as we ran, illuminating support timbers and ancient tool marks on the walls. "Do you know where this leads?" Miguel gasped as we ran. "Away from them," I replied, hoping it was true. The tunnel twisted and branched. I chose paths that seemed to angle upward, praying they would lead to the surface. Behind us, the scraping sounds continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. After what felt like an eternity of running, the tunnel widened into another chamber, smaller than the first, with a partial cave-in along one wall. Through the collapsed section, I could see modern concrete and rebar, part of the foundation of another building. "We must be outside the supermarket property by now," I said, examining the breach. "If we can widen this gap." Miguel was already pulling at the looser rubble, creating a space large enough to crawl through. Beyond the concrete was a utility space, pipes and electrical conduits running along a low ceiling. "This might connect to another building's maintenance area," Miguel said hopefully. We squeezed through the opening, finding ourselves in a narrow crawl space beneath what appeared to be an adjacent office complex. At the far end, a metal grate led to a larger maintenance room. The scraping sounds had faded, but I knew our pursuers were still tracking us. Whatever they were, ancient spirits, underground dwellers, hallucinations made real, they weren't giving up. We reached the grate and pushed it open, emerging into a utility room filled with water heaters and electrical panels. A door led to a hallway, dimly lit by emergency exit signs. We're in the office building next to the supermarket, Miguel realized, recognizing the space. If we can reach the parking lot, my car is still there. We moved quickly through the deserted building, following exit signs. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound a potential threat. The iron spike remained clutched in my hand, our only proven defense. We burst through an emergency exit into the night air, triggering an alarm that wailed into the darkness. The supermarket's illuminated sign glowed 100 yards away across the shared parking lot. Miguel's car sat alone near the loading dock. "Keys," I gasped. "Tell me you have your keys." He patted his pockets frantically, then slumped in relief as he produced them. "Let's go." We sprinted across the open space, painfully exposed under the parking lot lights. As we reached the car, I glanced back at the supermarket. Dark figures stood at its entrance, the manager, a security guard, and what appeared to be a cleaner in blue coveralls. They were perfectly still, watching us with vacant eyes across the parking lot. "Drive," I urged as we threw ourselves into the car. "Get us out of here now." Miguel's hands shook as he started the engine. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The figures hadn't moved to pursue us, but they continued to watch until we turned onto the main road and accelerated into the night. "We need to call the police," Miguel said, his voice trembling. "Tell them about the people in the chamber." I shook my head. "With what evidence?" "The dash cam didn't record anything last time. They'll think we're crazy, or worse, that we're involved in the disappearances." "Then what do we do?" "We can't just leave those people there." I stared out at the darkened streets of Denver, my mind racing. "We need proof. Irrefutable evidence of what's happening. And we need to understand what we're dealing with." The first rays of dawn were breaking over the mountains as Miguel dropped me at my apartment. We agreed to meet later that day after getting some rest and researching what we discovered. But as I stepped into my darkened apartment, I felt a familiar chill, the same heavy atmosphere I'd experienced in the parking garage. A metallic smell hung in the air. I turned on the lights, heart pounding. Nothing seemed disturbed. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Except for one thing. On my kitchen counter lay a Denver Value Mart receipt, one I had no memory of bringing home. Written on the back in jagged, uneven script were 5 words. "The darkness always finds you." I didn't sleep. How could I? Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move while I wasn't looking directly at it. Every creak and settling noise sent my heart racing. I kept the lights on and the iron spike close. By morning, I'd convinced myself that the note was a twisted prank, Miguel trying to scare me, perhaps. Or maybe I've written it myself in some dissociative state brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I called Miguel repeatedly. No answer. Texts went unread. Had they found him? Or was he simply sleeping off our nightmarish experience? While waiting for a response, I researched obsessively. I found references to Denver's mining history, to tunnels that supposedly ran beneath parts of the city. Old newspaper articles mentioned miners going missing, attributed to cave-ins or desertion. But a few accounts hinted at something else, reports of strange atmospheres in deeper tunnels, of miners refusing to return after claiming they weren't alone down there. Around noon, my phone finally buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Can't talk. Being watched. Don't trust anyone from the store." Meet me at the library at 3. The downtown public library was busy enough to provide anonymity but quiet enough for conversation. I arrived early, scanning the main reading room for any sign of Miguel or potential followers. The iron spike weighed heavily in my jacket pocket, an irrational comfort against rational fear. Miguel arrived at 3:15, looking haggard. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His hands trembled as he sat across from me. "They came to my house," he whispered without preamble. The security guard and another employee I didn't recognize. Standing across the street, watching my windows all night. "Did they approach you?" He shook his head. "Just watched. But when I left this morning, they followed me for 3 blocks before turning back." "We need to go to the police," I insisted. "With what?" "A story about possessed supermarket employees and underground halters?" Miguel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "They'll lock us up for psychiatric evaluation." He was right. We needed evidence. But how could we gather it when our cameras failed to capture what we saw? "I've been researching what we saw," I said, lowering my voice further. "There are old legends about mine spirits in Colorado's gold rush era. Miners reported seeing figures in the darkness, hearing voices that didn't belong to any worker. Folklore," Miguel dismissed. "What we saw was real. What if it's both?" I leaned forward. What if these legends were attempts to explain actual encounters? Indigenous stories from this region speak of entities that dwell underground, ancient beings that feed on fear and life force. Miguel stared at me. "You think we're dealing with actual supernatural entities?" I don't know what to believe anymore. I produced the receipt with its ominous message. "But they know where I live. And they're watching you too." He examined the note, his face paling. "This is Lisa's handwriting." At my confused look, he clarified, "The cashier who disappeared. I'd recognize it anywhere." A chill ran through me. Then she's still alive. Somehow. Or whatever's controlling her is. We sat in silence, the implications settling over us like a shadow. 4 victims still breathing but not truly alive were ranged around an ancient altar. A 5th chair, empty, waiting for its next occupant. "The iron affected them," I finally said. "When I struck the manager with the railroad spike, it burned him." That's consistent with folklore about supernatural entities being vulnerable to iron. "So what, we arm ourselves with iron and go back down there?" Miguel shook his head. "We barely escaped last time. Not without a plan." I pulled out my phone, opening the notes I compiled. The pattern I saw carved behind the altar, I found something similar in an anthropology text about indigenous rock art from this region. It's associated with entities called Hollow Ones, beings that could wear human skins but lacked souls of their own. Miguel's expression was skeptical, but he didn't dismiss the information. "Assuming this is real, how do we fight them? How do we free the victims?" The texts mention a ritual of binding and banishing. I showed him an image of ancient pictographs. Iron contains them, fire cleanses the space, and the symbol must be broken. That doesn't exactly read like a scientific solution. Do you have a better idea? Whatever they are, they clearly have rules they operate by. The flickering lights, the restricted movement, the vulnerability to iron. Miguel was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can get us back in. Night staff is minimal, just the security guard and a cleaner. Both were at the entrance last night, watching us. I'm guessing they're compromised. We need to avoid them. Is there another way in?" The receiving office has a separate entrance and its own stairs down to P2. It's usually locked, but I have access. We spent the next hour planning our return, mapping what we knew of the underground passages and preparing for what we might encounter. As evening approached, we gathered our supplies, iron nails and tools, road flares that would burn even in damp conditions, hammers to destroy the carved symbol, and heavy-duty flashlights. We also brought ropes and a collapsible stretcher. If any of the victims could be moved, we would try to rescue them. But first, we needed proof, evidence that would convince authorities to investigate, to seal off the tunnels permanently. We returned to the supermarket at 11:30 that night. The store had closed at 9, and only a few staff vehicles remained in the lot. We parked several blocks away and approached on foot, staying in shadows to avoid security cameras. The receiving entrance was locked as expected, but Miguel's keycard granted us access. We slipped inside, moving through the dark and loading bay toward the stairs that would take us to the underground parking. "Wait," Miguel whispered, pulling me behind a stack of pallets. "Listen." Footsteps echoed from the main part of the store, heavy, deliberate steps moving with mechanical precision. Through a gap in the pallets, I could see a security guard making rounds, his movements unnaturally stiff. "He's one of them," I breathed. "We need to avoid him." We waited until the footsteps receded, then continued toward the stairwell. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a concrete shaft descending into darkness. "Power's still on," Miguel noted, pointing to the indicator lights on the walls. "But let's use our flashlights instead of hitting the switches. Less noticeable." We descended the stairs slowly, every sense alert for danger. The air grew cooler, carrying that now familiar metallic scent. When we reached P2, we paused at the door, listening for any sound from beyond. Silence. I eased the door open, peering into the parking level. The overhead lights were dimmed to their night setting, creating larger pools of shadow between islands of weak illumination. The garage appeared empty. "The maintenance door is on the far side," I whispered. "Stay close." We moved cautiously through the garage, hugging the wall to avoid the central open space. Every few steps, we paused to listen, to scan for movement. The maintenance door stood as we had left it, slightly ajar, darkness yawning beyond. Miguel unclipped the small digital recorder from his belt. "Testing," he whispered into it. "If you find this recording, we entered the tunnel system beneath Denver Valley Mart on March 3, 2025, to gather evidence of what happened to the missing persons." I nodded approval. If nothing else, this might explain what we were doing here if things went wrong. We slipped through the door into the utility corridor. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved deeper, transitioning from modern construction to the older mine tunnel. Our flashlight beams revealed the packed earth floor, the ancient timber supports, the narrow gauge rails. "Remember," I said softly, "we're here for evidence first. If we can free the victims, we will, but we need to document everything." Miguel nodded, his face set with determination. "This way to the main chamber." We followed the tunnel, our footsteps muffled by the earthen floor. At each junction, we marked our path with small pieces of reflective tape, breadcrumbs to follow our retreat. After what seemed like an eternity of creeping through oppressive darkness, we reached the entrance to the chamber. The space beyond appeared as we had left it, the ancient mining equipment, the stone altar, the circle of chairs. But something was different. "There are 5 people now," Miguel whispered, his voice cracking. He was right. The 5th chair was now occupied, a young woman in a Denver Valley Mart uniform, her posture matching the others, her eyes open but unseeing. Her name badge read Rebecca. She must have been taken today, I breathed. We have to hurry. We entered the chamber cautiously, recording everything with our phones and Miguel's digital recorder. I examined the victims more closely, noting their slow, shallow breathing and the waxy quality of their skin. They're in some kind of suspended state, I said, my medical training proving inadequate to explain what I was seeing. Almost hibernating, but aware somehow. Miguel was documenting the altar and the symbol carved behind it. This matches what you showed me at the library, he confirmed. The Hollow One symbol. The altar itself held a disturbing collection of personal items, not just wallets and phones, but more intimate objects, a child's drawing, a wedding ring, a handwritten letter. Offerings or anchors, connecting these people to their former lives. We need to destroy the symbol, I said, retrieving a hammer from my backpack. According to the lore, that should break their control. Before I could approach the wall, a cold draft swept through the chamber, extinguishing our flashlights simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, I heard Miguel's panic breathing beside me. They know we're here, he whispered. I fumbled with my flashlight, slapping it against my palm. Nothing. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes like a physical weight. Then, from the tunnel entrance came the sound we dreaded, scraping footsteps, multiple sets, approaching slowly but deliberately. The flares, I hissed. Light a flare. I heard Miguel's movements, the scratch of a striker, then blessed light bloomed in his hands. The red glow of the flare cast long, dancing shadows across the chamber, transforming the seated victims into grotesque statues. In that crimson illumination, I saw movement at the chamber entrance. 3 figures stood watching us, the manager, the security guard, and a cashier I recognized from my previous visits. Their faces were passive, their eyes clouded, but their bodies moved with that same puppet-like coordination. You should not have returned, they spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in unnatural harmony. The darkness claimed you once. It will claim you again. What did you do to these people? Miguel demanded, his voice stronger than I expected. The 3 figures tilted their heads in perfect synchronization. We preserved them. We were them when needed. When not needed, they wait. I gripped the iron spike tightly. You can't have them. Or us. A sound emerged from the 3 figures, not quite laughter, more like the grinding of stone against stone. You do not understand. You were already part of us. They stepped aside, revealing a 6th figure in the tunnel entrance. It was me. Or something wearing my face, my clothes, a perfect duplicate down to the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. Only the eyes were wrong, clouded, vacant, yet somehow aware. Miguel gasped beside me. Alex? Ow. I backed away, mind reeling. That's not me. I'm me. That's something else. The thing wearing my face smiled, the expression not quite reaching its eyes. Are you certain? Which of you emerged from the tunnels last night? Which of you has been walking through the world since then? A terrible doubt seized me. The missing hours of sleep, the dissociative feelings, the note I couldn't remember bringing home, had I been compromised without knowing it? Don't listen, I told Miguel, never taking my eyes off my doppelganger. They're trying to confuse us. The 4 figures began to advance slowly into the chamber, moving with that distinctive mechanical gait. The ritual, I reminded Miguel urgently. We need to complete it now. While keeping the flare extended toward the approaching figures, Miguel fumbled in his backpack for the iron nails we had brought. I positioned myself between him and the entities, the iron spike held before me like a talisman. The symbol first, I called over my shoulder. Break the carving on the wall. Miguel rushed to the back of the chamber, hammering frantically at the spiral pattern carved into the rock. Each strike sent a shower of stone fragments into the air. The effect on our pursuers was immediate and disturbing. They convulsed as one, heads jerking at unnatural angles, limbs twitching. The thing wearing my face snarled, the sound more animal than human. Iron, I shouted to Miguel. Use the iron. He drove an iron nail into the center of the damaged symbol, then began placing more around its perimeter. With each placement, our opponents seemed to weaken, their movements becoming more erratic, less coordinated. I backed toward Miguel, keeping the iron spike extended. The fire. We need to cleanse with fire. He lit a second flare, holding it to the base of the altar. The stone was damp with age and mineral seepage, but the ancient wooden offerings caught quickly. Smoke filled the chamber, acrid and cleansing. The figures had stopped advancing but remained blocking our exit. My doppelganger's face contorted with rage, an expression I barely recognized on my own features. You cannot banish what has always dwelled in darkness, it hissed, its voice a distorted version of my own. We were here before your kind built above. We will remain when your lights fail. But not with these people, I replied, stepping forward with the iron spike. You can't have them anymore. As the flames rose higher, illuminating the chamber with dancing orange light, something remarkable happened. The seated victims began to stir, subtle movements at first, fingers twitching, eyelids fluttering. The clouded look in their eyes began to clear, awareness returning by degrees. The young woman, Rebecca, was the first to speak, her voice raspy from disuse. What? Where am I? We're getting you out of here, Miguel told her, helping her to her feet. The others were awakening too, confused and disoriented but alive, truly alive. Our adversaries sensed their control slipping. They surged forward in a final, desperate attack. The thing wearing my face reached for me with unnatural speed, its fingers elongating into claw-like appendages. I struck with the iron spike, driving it into my doppelganger's shoulder. The entity shrieked, a sound no human throat could produce. Where the iron made contact, its flesh sizzled and smoked, revealing something beneath that was neither skin nor muscle but a writhing darkness. Go! I shouted to Miguel. Get them out through the other tunnel. He hesitated, unwilling to leave me. What about you? I'll hold them off. Just go. The other three entities had closed in, surrounding me as Miguel led the victims toward the secondary tunnel we had discovered the previous night. My doppelganger yanked the iron spike from its shoulder, the wound seeping not blood but a viscous black substance. I struck out with another iron tool, a crowbar from my pack, keeping them at bay as the flames spread from the altar to the ancient timbers supporting the chamber ceiling. Smoke billowed thicker now, obscuring my vision. Through the haze, I saw Miguel disappear into the secondary tunnel with the last of the victims. They would make it. Even if I didn't, they would be safe. The entities pressed closer, my doppelganger in the lead. Its face, my face, began to slip as if the skin were a mask loosening from its moorings. Beneath, I caught glimpses of something ancient and inhuman, eyes that had never known sunlight, features that had never been meant to mimic humanity. You will remain, it said, reaching for me again. One must always remain. I backed away, feeling the heat of the growing fire behind me. The chamber was becoming unstable, ancient timbers groaning as the flames weakened them. Pieces of the ceiling began to fall, small at first, then larger chunks of stone and earth. The entities hesitated, seeming to sense the coming collapse. In their moment of uncertainty, I made my decision. I hurled the crowbar directly at my doppelganger, striking it in the center of its chest. The iron sank into its body like a hot knife through butter, eliciting another inhuman shriek. Then I turned and ran for the secondary tunnel, ducking under falling debris. Behind me, the chamber's ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. Dust and smoke chased me as I sprinted through the narrow passage, following the reflective markers Miguel had left. The tunnel shook with aftershocks from the collapse, smaller sections beginning to fail as I ran. I could hear the destruction spreading, following me like a wave. Ahead, a faint light appeared, the breach in the foundation that led to the adjacent office building. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning from exertion and smoke. Just as I reached the opening, the tunnel behind me collapsed completely. The force threw me forward through the gap into the utility crawlspace beyond. I lay gasping on the concrete floor, covered in dust and soot but alive. Remarkably, terrifyingly alive. In the distance, I could hear sirens, police and fire vehicles responding to the alarm Miguel must have triggered upon reaching the surface. Help was coming. It was over. Or was it? As I struggled to my feet, a terrible thought seized me. The doppelganger's words echoed in my mind. Which of you emerged from the tunnels last night? Which of you has been walking through the world since then? I stared at my hands, suddenly unsure. Was I truly myself? Or was I something else now, something wearing Alex Chen like a second skin? I found a sharp edge on a nearby pipe and pressed my palm against it, drawing blood. Red, human blood, not the black ichor that had seeped from my double. Still, doubt lingered. Would I know if I had been changed? Would I feel any different if something ancient and dark now looked out through my eyes? I made my way through the utility room to the hallway beyond, following the sound of voices. Miguel stood with the rescue victims, speaking urgently to police officers and paramedics who had responded to the alarm. When he saw me, his expression shifted from relief to momentary uncertainty, the same question in his eyes that tormented my thoughts. "Alex," he said cautiously, "is it you?" I nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Was it me? How could either of us be sure? The paramedics took over, wrapping me in a shock blanket, checking my vitals, asking questions I barely heard. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me shaky and disoriented. As I was led to an ambulance, Miguel approached, keeping a careful distance. "The tunnels collapsed," he said. "Fire department says the whole system under the supermarket is caving in. They're evacuating nearby buildings as a precaution." "Good," I managed. "Seal it all. Bury it." He studied my face intently. "Is it over?" I thought of the darkness beneath the city, the ancient presence that had dwelt there long before Denver existed. Had we truly banished it, or merely contained it temporarily? I don't know, I admitted. But those people are safe now. That's what matters. Miguel nodded, but the wariness remained in his eyes. How will we know? If it takes someone else? If it comes back? I had no answer for him. We had glimpsed something beyond ordinary understanding, something that perhaps humans weren't meant to comprehend. The darkness had been there before us and would remain long after. As the ambulance doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the Denver Valley marked through the window. Even from this distance, I could see that the lights in the parking garage had failed completely, leaving only darkness below. And in that darkness, something might still be waiting, patient and ancient, for the next unsuspecting visitor to venture down alone. After all, the fifth chair stood empty once again. Have you ever felt that the walls around you hide more than just empty spaces? The narrow brownstone buildings of Old City, Philadelphia had always fascinated me. As a private detective with 15 years of experience, I'd seen my share of strange cases, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me at 23 Elkin Street. My name is Daniel Pierce, and I specialize in the cases other investigators won't touch, the ones that linger in the shadows between rational explanation and something altogether more disturbing. Mrs. Abernathy approached me on a Tuesday morning in November, when the rain tapped against my office windows like impatient fingers. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that darted nervously around my cluttered office. "It's the crying, Mr. Pierce," she whispered, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "Every night for the past 3 weeks. A woman sobbing behind the walls of the house next door. The police say they've investigated, but they found nothing. The property has been vacant for months. It's in probate, they say." I nodded, jotting notes in my worn leather notebook. "And you're certain it's coming from inside the building? Not echoing from elsewhere on the street?" "I know what I hear," she said firmly. "Sometimes it's crying, sometimes whispering, words I can't quite make out. And footsteps, pacing back and forth, back and forth." Her fingers danced across the desk, mimicking the sound. I took the case, more out of curiosity than anything else. $500 for what seemed like a simple investigation, probably squatters, or perhaps the settling of an old house that had stood empty too long. I'd seen many cases where grief or loneliness led people to hear things that weren't there. That evening, I parked my car a block away and approached the house on foot. Number 21, where Mrs. Abernathy lived, was well maintained, with warm lights spilling from its windows onto the wet sidewalk. Number 23, however, loomed like a dark tooth in an otherwise healthy smile. Its windows were shuttered, the small front garden overgrown with tangled vines that seemed to reach for me as I passed. I circled the property first, noting the padlocked back gate and the thick growth of ivy that obscured much of the brick facade. A faint scent caught my attention, something sweet yet slightly rotten, like overripe fruit. The smell seemed to strengthen as I approached the narrow alley between the houses. Using the key Mrs. Abernathy had procured from the property management company, I unlocked the front door. It swung open with surprising silence, as though the hinges had been recently oiled. I stepped inside, and the floorboards creaked beneath my weight despite my attempt to tread lightly. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust and something else, a cloying heaviness that made each breath feel labored. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a modest foyer. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, like shedding skin. A staircase ascended into darkness, and doorways led to what I presumed were the living room and dining room. I moved through the house methodically, room by room, noting nothing particularly unusual for an abandoned dwelling. The furniture was gone, leaving only indentations in the carpet where heavy pieces had once stood. In the kitchen, a faucet dripped steadily, the sound amplified in the empty space. The second floor held 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all empty save for dust and shadows. I was about to dismiss Mrs. Abernathy's concerns as an overactive imagination when I noticed something odd about the layout. The dimensions seemed wrong. The master bedroom should have extended farther, based on the exterior of the house and the floor below. I tapped my knuckles against the wall, listening for the hollow sound of drywall. Instead, I heard the solid thunk of brick. Pressing my ear against the wall, I listened intently but heard nothing beyond my own breathing. As I straightened up, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the floor, a thin line of what looked like red paint or perhaps rust, seeping from beneath the wall. I crouched down, running my finger along the substance. It was tacky to the touch, not fully dried. A sudden thud directly behind the wall made me jerk back, heart hammering in my chest. Then came the sound that sent ice through my veins, a low, mournful sob, unmistakably feminine, so close it could have been right beside me. "Hello?" I called, pressing my palm flat against the wall. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear any movement, any breath. "I'm here to help," I said, feeling foolish speaking to a wall, yet unable to shake the certainty that someone, or something, was listening. A soft scratching sound began, like fingernails dragging slowly across the other side of the bricks. It moved horizontally at about the height of my chest, then stopped. I stepped back, my flashlight beam wavering as my hand trembled slightly. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a hidden door, a concealed room where someone had become trapped. But another part, a more primitive instinct, screamed at me to leave, to run from this house and never return. I chose the middle path. "I'll be back tomorrow," I announced to the empty room, to the wall, to whatever might be listening. "With tools. If you're trapped, I'll get you out." As I turned to leave, my flashlight swept across the far corner of the room, illuminating what I had missed before, a small, ornate picture frame hanging on the adjacent wall. Inside was a faded sepia photograph of a family, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, a woman whose eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness, and 3 children arranged in front of them, their faces solemn. I approached the photograph, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. As the beam of light fell fully upon the woman's face, I felt my blood turn to ice. Though faded with age, her features were unmistakable, the same delicate nose, the same subtle curve of the lips. She was identical to Mrs. Abernathy. As I stared, transfixed, something moved in the glass reflection behind me, a pale face, eyes wide and dark, mouth open in a silent scream. I whirled around, but there was only the empty room, the solid wall, and the silky darkness beyond my flashlight's beam. That night, as I lay in my bed 3 blocks away, I could still hear that soft sobbing echoing in my ears, could still feel the chill that had crept through my bones in that upstairs bedroom. Sleep eluded me as questions tumbled through my mind. What lay behind that wall? And why did Mrs. Abernathy never mention her resemblance to the woman in the photograph? Tomorrow, I would return with tools and answers. But as the first gray light of dawn filtered through my blinds, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited behind that wall had been waiting a very long time, and that now it knew I was coming. What truths do we wall away, hoping they'll be forgotten? Morning brought no clarity, only a dull headache and the lingering unease that had followed me from 23 Elkin Street. Over coffee, I researched the property's history, uncovering that the house had been built in 1878 by a merchant named Theodore Caldwell. According to public records, the Caldwell family had occupied the residence until 1921, when it was sold following what newspaper archives cryptically referred to as a family tragedy. The house had changed hands 7 times since then, with no owner staying longer than a decade. The most recent residents, an elderly couple named Winters, had both died within months of each other the previous year. Their distant nephew in California had inherited the property and placed it on the market, where it had sat unsold for almost a year. Before returning to the house, I visited Mrs. Abernathy, intending to ask about her family history and the photograph. Her modest home was cluttered with knickknacks and smelled of jasmine tea. She invited me in, hands trembling slightly as she poured steaming liquid into delicate cups. "Have you discovered anything?" she asked, eyes hopeful yet fearful. "Mrs. Abernathy, do you have any family connection to the Caldwells who built the house next door?" She frowned, creases deepening around her mouth. "Caldwells? No, I don't believe so. My family is from Boston originally. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then described the photograph. As I spoke, her face grew pale, the teacup rattling against its saucer. That's impossible," she whispered. "The house was emptied months ago. There was no such photograph when I went through with the realtor." "You've been inside?" "Just once, when it was first listed. I was curious about the floor plan, how it compared to mine." She set down her cup. "But there were no pictures left, Mr. Pierce. Nothing on the walls at all." I pondered this as I gathered my tools, a hammer, chisel, small crowbar, and a more powerful flashlight. Either Mrs. Abernathy was lying, or the photograph had appeared sometime after her visit. Neither option settled well with me. The house seemed to be waiting for my return, the front door swinging open at the lightest touch of my key. Afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the empty rooms. As I climbed the stairs, each creak seemed deliberate, announcing my presence to the silent house. In the master bedroom, I immediately looked for the photograph, but the wall was bare. I ran my fingers over the faded wallpaper, finding a small nail where the frame had hung, but no other evidence of its existence. Had I imagined it? The lack of sleep, the suggestive atmosphere of the abandoned house, could they have conspired to create such a vivid hallucination? But the wall that didn't match the exterior dimensions of the house, that was real and solid beneath my touch. I knocked again, listening to the dull thud of brick rather than the hollow sound drywall would produce. No crying came, no scratching. Just silence. I placed my tools on the floor and began examining the wall more carefully, looking for any seam or indication of a hidden door. Near the bottom, I noticed a slight discoloration in the baseboard, a darker stain that might have been water damage or something else entirely. Kneeling, I ran my fingers along it and found the wood slightly warped, as if from prolonged exposure to moisture. With my chisel, I pried at the baseboard. It came away with surprising ease, revealing a small gap between the floor and the brick wall. Lying flat, I shone my flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a narrow space, perhaps 3 feet wide, between this wall and another. "Hello?" I called into the gap. My voice echoed slightly, confirming the existence of a sealed room. No response came, but as I watched, a small puff of dust rose from the floor of the hidden space, as if disturbed by movement. I jerked back, heart racing. Something was in there. Something that moved. With renewed determination, I attacked the wall with my crowbar, leveraging it against the brick. The mortar was old and crumbled easily beneath my efforts. Brick by brick, I created an opening large enough to peer through. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of the scent I detected outside. I shone my flashlight through the hole I created, revealing a small room, perhaps 8 feet square. The walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper, and a single window had been bricked up from the outside, leaving only the faintest outline visible. What made my breath catch in my throat were the portraits that covered every available inch of wall space. dozens of them, in frames both ornate and simple, all showing the same family in different poses and settings. The Caldwells, I presumed, the stern-faced father, the sad-eyed mother, the solemn children. In some, they were pictured individually, in others, as a group. But in every image, their eyes seemed to follow the movement of my flashlight beam. In the center of the room sat a rocking chair, facing away from me. It was still. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice hoarser than I intended. The chair began to rock, slowly at first, then with increasing vigor. From my position, I could see no one sitting in it. My rational mind grasped for explanations, air currents from the opening I'd made, perhaps, or an uneven floor causing the chair to move. But these thoughts dissipated like smoke as a low humming began, a melody I didn't recognize sung in a woman's voice, soft and somehow plaintive. I widened the hole, removing more bricks until I could squeeze my shoulders through. Something compelled me forward despite every instinct screaming to retreat. As I pulled myself into the hidden room, the humming stopped. Standing now in the small space, surrounded by the watchful eyes of the Caldwell family, I approached the rocking chair cautiously. It was empty, still swaying slightly as if recently vacated. The seat cushion bore a depression, as though formed by years of use by the same person. On a small table beside the chair lay a leather-bound book. I picked it up, my flashlight revealing its contents, a diary, the pages filled with a delicate, flowing script. The first entry was dated September 3rd, 1878. "Theodore has finally completed our home. It is beautiful, though smaller than our previous residence. He assures me that once his business recovers from its recent setbacks, we shall move to a grander house. Until then, I shall make this place a happy home for our children, though I miss the countryside terribly. The city air disagrees with little Eleanor's lungs, and she coughs through the night." I flipped forward several pages, landing on an entry from June 12, 1879. "Theodore's temper grows worse with each passing month. Today he struck William for merely dropping a glass. I dare not interfere, for when I do, his rage turns upon me. The children and I have taken to sitting in this small room I have claimed as my private sanctuary. Theodore rarely comes here, preferring his study downstairs. I have hung family portraits to remind us of happier times, but when I look at them now, I see only strangers wearing our faces. Heart pounding, I turned to the final pages. The handwriting had deteriorated, becoming jagged and frantic. November 21st, 1880. He knows. Theodore has discovered what I've done. I heard him in the night, whispering that I would never leave this house, that none of us would. He has begun breaking up my sanctuary's window, claiming it is to keep out the winter cold. But I know his true purpose. Just as I know that the cellar now contains more than coal and preserves. The children ask for their father, but how can I tell them? How can I say that the monster wearing their father's face is not the man who once dandled them upon his knee? I write this in haste, for I hear his footsteps on the stairs. May God have mercy on our souls, for Theodore will not. The diary ended there, the remaining pages blank. With trembling hands, I set it back on the table, a cold weight settling in my stomach. As I did so, my elbow bumped against the rocking chair, sending it into motion once more. A soft sigh sounded directly behind me. I whirled around, but the room was empty save for the portraits and myself. Yet I could feel a presence, as tangible as the chill that now permeated the air. "Margaret Caldwell?" I whispered, the name taken from the diary's inscribed front page. The temperature plummeted further, my breath fogging in front of my face. The rocking chair's movement became more pronounced, creaking rhythmically against the wooden floor. And then, a whisper, so close to my ear that I felt the breath of it. "He's coming." I stumbled backward, colliding with the wall of portraits. Several frames fell, glass shattering on the floor. As I looked down at the broken glass, I saw a reflection that was not my own, a woman with hollow eyes and a bruised face, her mouth open in a warning I couldn't hear. A loud thud came from the floor below, like a heavy footstep. Then another. Something was ascending the stairs, each step deliberate and menacing. I lunged for the opening I created, suddenly desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the hidden room. As I squeezed through, a hand, cold, impossibly cold, brushed against my ankle. I kicked reflexively, hearing a soft cry that might have been pain or desperation. Back in the master bedroom, I gathered my tools with shaking hands. The footsteps had reached the second floor landing now, slow and measured. I had no desire to encounter whatever approached, whether it was Theodore Caldwell's restless spirit or something born of my own mounting terror. I moved quickly to the hallway, intending to descend the stairs and leave this accursed house. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. Standing at the bottom, looking up at me with eyes like black pits and a pale face, was a tall figure in antiquated dress. A man with a thick mustache, his features contorted in a rictus of rage. One hand gripped the banister, the other held something that gleamed dully in the dim light, a straight razor, its edge catching what little illumination filtered through the dusty windows. We stared at each other across the expanse of the staircase, neither moving. Then, with deliberate slowness, he placed his foot on the first step and began to ascend toward me. I backed away, my mind racing. The only other exit from the second floor was the window at the end of the hallway. I ran toward it, fumbling with the latch. Years of pain had sealed it shut. With a silent prayer, I smashed the glass with my flashlight, clearing away the shards as best I could. Behind me, the footsteps grew closer. A voice, deep and resonant with malice, called out, "She is mine. They are all mine. This house keeps what belongs to it." I didn't look back as I forced my body through the window, cutting my hands on the remaining glass. The drop to the small roof of the back porch was only about 10 feet, but it felt like leaping into an abyss. I landed hard, the impact sending shockwaves through my legs. Without pausing, I scrambled to the edge and dropped to the overgrown garden below. As I looked up at the broken window, a face appeared, not the man's, but the woman's, her sad eyes following me as I backed away. For a moment, her features seemed to shift, becoming those of Mrs. Abernathy, then returning to the countenance I recognized from the portraits. "Save them," she mouthed, her hands pressed against the glass. "Please." Then she was gone, and the window was empty save for the jagged edges of broken glass that caught the fading daylight like teeth. I fled through the back gate, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized two things with startling clarity. The Caldwell family had met a fate too terrible to be recorded in public documents, and Mrs. Abernathy knew far more than she had revealed to me. Night was falling as I drove away from Elkin Street, but I knew I would return. Something tethered me to that house now, something beyond professional obligation or curiosity. The diary in my pocket felt heavy with its secrets, and in my mind, Margaret Caldwell's eyes watched me, waiting to see if I would be her family's salvation or merely the latest witness to their eternal imprisonment. Why do some souls refuse to leave the places where they suffered most? I spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, unable to face the solitude of my apartment. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of narrow rooms and endless staircases where I was pursued by a figure whose face I could never quite glimpse. Each time I woke, gasping and sweat-soaked, the diary seemed to call to me from where I placed it on the nightstand. By dawn, I had read it cover to cover 3 times, piecing together the tragic history of the Caldwell family. Theodore's business failures, his descent into alcoholism and violence, Margaret's desperate attempts to protect her children. The diary spoke of Theodore's growing paranoia, his conviction that Margaret was planning to leave him to take the children back to her family in Boston. What it didn't explicitly state, what lay between the lines in Margaret's increasingly frantic entries, was what had happened in the final days. But I had my suspicions, dark and terrible as they were. Before returning to the house, I needed answers from Mrs. Abernathy. Her resemblance to Margaret Caldwell couldn't be coincidence, nor could her knowledge of the crying behind the walls. She opened her door on the first knock, as if she'd been waiting. Her face was haggard, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she'd slept as poorly as I had. "You've been in the room," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. I nodded, following her into her tidy living room. "Why didn't you tell me about your family connection to the Caldwells?" She sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of her years and more. "Because I wasn't certain until now. My grandmother Eleanor was just 4 years old when she was taken from that house. She was raised by her mother's sister in Boston and never spoke of her early life. All we knew was that her parents and siblings had died in some tragedy." "Eleanor," I repeated. "Margaret's youngest daughter, the one with the delicate lungs." Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "A few months ago, I found a box of my grandmother's belongings in my attic. Inside was a photograph and a letter from my great-aunt explaining that Eleanor had been the sole survivor of a terrible event in Philadelphia. When I realized the address matched this house, I had to come see it. I purchased this home 6 months ago specifically to be near the place where my family's history was buried." "But you told me you were from Boston originally," I said, my suspicion evident. "I am. And I never lied about not being related to the Caldwells. The name means nothing to me. My grandmother was raised as an Abernathy." She leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, I hired you because I needed someone else to confirm what I feared. I couldn't go back into that house myself, not after hearing her cries." "Her? Margaret's?" "Yes." She bit her lip. "Something terrible happened in that house, something my grandmother was too young to remember or too traumatized to speak of. But whatever it was, it's not finished." I placed the diary on the coffee table between us. "This provides some answers, but not all. Theodore Caldwell became violent, abusive. Margaret created the hidden room as a sanctuary for herself and the children. In her final entry, she suggests that Theodore had done something unthinkable, something involving the cellar." Mrs. Abernathy's hand trembled as she reached for the diary. "I need to know, Mr. Pierce. What happened to my family?" "I intend to find out," I said, rising. "Today." She caught my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Not alone. I'm coming with you." I started to protest, but the determination in her eyes silenced me. This was her family's tragedy. She had more right than I to uncover its truth. We entered the house together that afternoon, the sky overhead heavy with the promise of rain. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated at the threshold, closing her eyes briefly as if gathering courage. Then she stepped inside, her back straight and her chin lifted in defiance of whatever might await us. I led her to the hidden room, now accessible through the opening I created the day before. She moved with surprising agility for her age, climbing through without assistance. Once inside, she stood motionless, taking in the portraits that covered the walls. "This is her," she whispered, approaching one of a young woman with a baby in her arms. "Margaret. And this must be my grandmother." Her fingers hovered over the infant's face, not quite touching the image. While she examined the portraits, I tapped along the floorboards, listening for any hollow sound that might indicate another hidden space. Nothing. "The cellar," Mrs. Abernathy said suddenly. "We need to see the cellar." I nodded, helping her back through the opening. As we descended the stairs, I felt the same oppressive weight in the air that I'd experienced before. The house seemed to close around us, its walls creaking and settling as if in response to a presence. The cellar door was located off the kitchen, a heavy wooden affair with an iron latch. It swung open with a groan of protest, revealing a steep set of stone steps descending into darkness. I switched on my flashlight, the beam barely penetrating the thick gloom below. "Stay behind me," I instructed Mrs. Abernathy, taking the first step down. The cellar was larger than I expected, extending beneath the entire house. Stone walls glistened with moisture, and the earthen floor was damp beneath our feet. Old coal bins, empty now, lined one wall. Dusty shelves held ancient preserving jars, their contents long since turned to unidentifiable sludge. "There," Mrs. Abernathy said, pointing to the far corner. "The wall doesn't look right." She was correct. While the rest of the cellar walls were rough stone, this section had been bricked up in a manner similar to the hidden room upstairs. The brickwork was cruder, hastier, as if done by someone without masonry skills. Without hesitation, I approached the wall, examining the mortar between the bricks. It crumbled at my touch, far more deteriorated than the brickwork upstairs. With my crowbar, I pried at one of the bricks, which came loose with surprising ease. The smell that emanated from the opening was immediate and overwhelming, not the sweet, musty scent from the hidden room, but something far more primal and revolting. Mrs. Abernathy gagged, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. "Perhaps you should wait upstairs," I suggested, but she shook her head firmly. Brick by brick, I widened the opening, the nauseating odor growing stronger with each one removed. Finally, the hole was large enough to shine my flashlight through. What I saw made me step back involuntarily, a gasp escaping my lips. Behind the wall lay a small chamber, and within it, arranged with terrible care, were 4 skeletons. 3 were small, children, positioned as if in sleep on a rotted mattress. The 4th, larger skeleton sat in a chair facing them, the bones of its hands resting in its lap. Scraps of fabric, once clothing, still clung to the bones, and a delicate chain with a locket could be seen around the neck of the seated figure. Mrs. Abernathy made a small, broken sound beside me. "Margaret," she whispered. "And my aunt and uncle. William, Catherine, and Martha, I think her name was. Theodore must have killed them," I said, my voice hollow in the dank space. "Walled them up alive, while Eleanor somehow escaped or was away from the house." "No," Mrs. Abernathy said, her gaze fixed on the grotesque tableau. "Look closer." I shone the flashlight more directly on the adult skeleton. In its right hand, barely visible among the finger bones, was a small vial. And now I could see what I missed at first glance, the unnatural position of the children's skeletons, the discarded cup near the mattress. "She poisoned them," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice flat with shock. "To save them from him." As the words left her lips, a low moan echoed through the cellar, rising from somewhere beyond the brick wall. It grew in intensity, becoming a wail of unbearable grief and guilt. The temperature plummeted, our breath clouding before us in the sudden cold. "We need to go," I said, grasping Mrs. Abernathy's arm. "Now." But she pulled away, stepping closer to the opening. "Margaret," she called. "We understand. You were trying to protect them." The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in my ears. Then, softly at first but growing louder, came the sound of children's laughter, echoing from behind the wall where no living child had been for over a century. Mrs. Abernathy smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They forgive you," she said to the empty air. "They understand why you did it." A cold breeze brushed past us, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs, Margaret's perfume, according to her diary. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw them, 3 children running through the cellar, chasing each other with carefree abandon, and a woman watching them with love and relief in her eyes. Then they were gone, and we were alone in the damp darkness. Or so I thought. Heavy footsteps sounded on the floor above us, crossing from the front door toward the cellar stairs. Slow, measured steps that could not belong to any living person. "Theodore," Mrs. Abernathy breathed, her face draining of color. The cellar door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A shadow fell across the steps, elongated and distorted. Something was coming down, something that brought with it a wave of malevolence so tangible I could taste it, metallic, like blood. "Run," I urged Mrs. Abernathy, pulling her toward the coal chute that offered the only other exit from the cellar. "Go, now!" But she stood her ground, staring up at the descending shadow. "No," she said, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it. "This ends today. My family has been trapped here long enough." The figure that appeared at the bottom of the stairs barely resembled a man. Tall and gaunt, with a face twisted by rage and something else, hunger, perhaps, or possession. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light in the beam of my flashlight, and in his hand he still carried the straight razor I had seen the day before. "Mine," he growled, but word more vibration than sound. "They are mine. The house keeps what is mine." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, placing herself between the apparition and the wall that held her family's remains. "They were never yours, Theodore. Not in love and not in death. You never deserved them." The ghost, for what else could it be, let out a roar of fury and lunged toward her. I moved to intervene, but Mrs. Abernathy raised her hand, stopping me. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object, a child's wooden doll, blackened with age. "My grandmother kept this," she said, holding it toward the advancing spirit. "The only thing she took from this house. The last thing her mother gave her before sending her away to safety." Theodore's form flickered, like a candle in a draught. He stopped, razor raised, staring at the doll with an expression of confusion. "You have no power here anymore," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice gaining strength. "Your family is free of you. This house is not yours to haunt." A howl of rage and despair erupted from the spirit, its form elongating and twisting in ways that defied natural law. The very air seemed to vibrate with its fury. Objects around the cellar began to shake, jars falling from shelves, coal dust rising in swirling clouds. Mrs. Abernathy never flinched. She held the doll higher, her face set in determined lines. "By my blood, which is their blood, I reclaim them. Margaret, William, Catherine, Martha, you are free." The apparition rushed at her, razor slashing through the air, but where it should have struck her, it passed through empty space. Theodore's form seemed to dissolve, reforming a few feet away, confusion replacing rage on his spectral face. And then I saw them again, Margaret and the 3 children, standing behind Mrs. Abernathy, their forms more solid now, more present. Margaret stepped forward, placing an insubstantial hand on Mrs. Abernathy's shoulder. Their faces, so similar across the generations, mirrored each other in their defiance. "You never had us," Margaret's voice whispered, filling the cellar with its quiet intensity. "Not our souls. Not our love. And now, not even our fear." Theodore's form writhed, seeming to fight against some invisible force that pulled at him. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his edges began to blur, darkness seeping from him like smoke. "No!" The word tore from him, his form lunging one last time toward Mrs. Abernathy. But before he reached her, the ground beneath our feet shuddered. A deep groan emanated from the very foundations of the house, as if the structure itself was awakening. Cracks appeared in the cellar walls, spreading with alarming speed. Dust and small pieces of stone rained down from the ceiling. "The house," I gasped, grabbing Mrs. Abernathy's arm. "It's collapsing. We need to get out." This time she didn't resist, allowing me to pull her toward the coal chute. As we climbed the rusted ladder, I looked back one last time. Theodore's form was being dragged downward, as if the house itself was reclaiming him. Margaret and the children stood watching, their forms growing fainter as Theodore's was consumed by the earth. We barely made it out before the first major collapse. Scrambling through the overgrown garden, we reached the street just as a deep, thunderous roar erupted behind us. Turning, we watched in stunned silence as 23 Elkin Street seemed to fold in upon itself, the walls buckling and the roof caving inward with a sound like the death cry of some massive beast. Neighbors poured from surrounding houses, exclaiming in shock at the spectacle. Within minutes, the once proud brownstone was nothing but a pile of rubble, dust billowing into the afternoon sky like the last breath of a dying entity. Mrs. Abernathy stood beside me, clutching the wooden doll to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. But they were not tears of sorrow. I realized they were tears of relief. "It's over," she whispered. "After all these years, they're free." As we watched emergency vehicles arrive and responders secure the area, I couldn't help but wonder if they would find their remains behind the cellar wall, if the Caldwell family would finally receive a proper burial after more than a century of imprisonment. But somehow, I suspected the house had taken its secrets with it, burying them beneath tons of brick and timber where they would never again see the light of day. Mrs. Abernathy touched my arm. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," she said quietly. "I couldn't have done this without you." I nodded, unable to find adequate words for what we had just experienced. In my pocket, Margaret's diary seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the last testament of a mother driven to unthinkable acts by a monster wearing her husband's face. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one final time at the ruins. For just a moment, backlit by the setting sun, I thought I saw 4 figures standing amid the wreckage, a woman and 3 children, hands linked, faces turned toward the sky in an expression of perfect peace. Then the dust shifted, and they were gone. The Caldwell family had finally escaped their dark house in Philadelphia. And Theodore, I believed, had been claimed by whatever malevolent force had twisted him in life, trapped forever in the rubble of his own making, alone with his rage and madness for all eternity. Can a place ever truly forget the horrors it has witnessed? 3 weeks after the collapse of 23 Elkin Street, I sat in my office reviewing the final report. The official explanation cited structural failure due to long-term neglect and recent heavy rainfall. No mention was made of the 4 skeletons recovered from behind a brick wall in what remained of the cellar, a discovery attributed to historical remains that were promptly removed for examination by the medical examiner. Mrs. Abernathy had quietly arranged for their proper burial in a small cemetery outside the city, beneath a modest headstone that bore only the Caldwell name and the inscription, "Finally at peace." She hadn't invited me to the service, and I hadn't asked to attend. Some rituals are too personal for outsiders, even those who have shared in the experience that necessitated them. I closed the file, sliding it into my desk drawer along with Margaret's diary, which Mrs. Abernathy had insisted I keep. "Someone should remember their story," she had said. "Someone who understands what really happened." I wasn't sure I could claim to truly understand, but I had witnessed enough to know that the official report barely scratched the surface of the truth. Rain tapped against my window, a gentle percussion that somehow reminded me of fingernails scratching against brick. I shivered, reaching for my coffee mug only to find it empty. As I rose to refill it, a knock sounded at my door. "Come in," I called, expecting my secretary with the day's mail. Instead, Mrs. Abernathy entered, looking years younger than when I had first met her. The weight of her family's secret had lifted from her shoulders, leaving her standing taller, her eyes clearer. "Mr. Pierce," she greeted me with a small smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I assured her, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What brings you by?" "I thought you were returning to Boston this week." "I am," she said, settling into the seat. "My flight leaves tomorrow morning. But before I left, I wanted to give you something." From her purse, she withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. With careful movements, she unwrapped it, revealing the wooden doll she had used to confront Theodore's spirit. "This belongs with the diary," she said, placing it on my desk. "I've kept it long enough." I stared at the simple toy, a crude carving of a girl with faded paint indicating a blue dress and yellow hair. One arm was missing, but was splintered where it had broken off. "Are you sure?" "It's been in your family for generations, and its purpose has been fulfilled," she replied firmly. "Besides, I'm the end of my line. No children to pass it to." A shadow crossed her face. "The Caldwell blood ends with me." I nodded, accepting her decision. "Have you decided what to do about the property?" The collapse had left a vacant lot where the house once stood, a gap-toothed space in the otherwise intact row of brownstones. Mrs. Abernathy, as the only living descendant of the original owner, had inherited the land once the legal complications were sorted out. "I'm donating it to the city," she said. "They're going to make it into a small park. A place of light and life, rather than darkness and death." She smiled. "I think Margaret would approve." "I think she would," I agreed, remembering the peaceful expressions on the spectral faces I had glimpsed in the ruins. Mrs. Abernathy rose to leave, then hesitated. "There is one other reason I came today," she admitted. "I wanted to ask, have you had any dreams since that day?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't spoken to anyone about the nightmares that had plagued me since the house's collapse, dreams of endless staircases, of walls that breathed, of a razor-wielding shadow that pursued me through narrow corridors. "Some," I acknowledged cautiously. "Nothing significant." "Why do you ask?" She studied my face, her eyes knowing. "Because they'll fade, Mr. Pierce. The dreams, the memories, even the certainty of what we saw and did. The human mind isn't designed to hold such experiences for long. It files them away, blurs their edges, until they seem more like stories we've heard than events we've lived through." "Is that what happened to your grandmother?" I asked. Did she forget the truth of her family's fate? I believe she knew, Mrs. Abernathy said quietly. On some level. But she protected herself by forgetting the details, by never speaking of it. She reached across the desk, her fingers briefly touching the wooden doll. Some burdens are too heavy to carry consciously. After she left, I sat for a long time looking at the doll beside Margaret's diary. Two artifacts from a tragedy a century old, now in my possession. I wondered if Mrs. Abernathy was right, if the sharp clarity of my memories would dull with time, if the terror I had felt in that collapsing cellar would eventually seem like nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. Part of me hoped she was correct. Another part feared the forgetting, feared that without the sting of remembrance, the Caldwell family's suffering would be diminished, their liberation rendered meaningless. That evening, I walked past the empty lot where 23 Elkin Street had stood. City workers had cleared away the debris, leaving only a rectangle of bare earth surrounded by a temporary fence. In the gathering dusk, it looked peaceful, ordinary, just another urban space awaiting transformation. I paused at the fence, my fingers curling around the chain links. Rest well, I murmured, unsure if I was addressing the land itself or those who had finally escaped its confines. As I turned to leave, a soft sound caught my attention, a child's laughter, distant yet distinct, carried on the evening breeze. I froze, listening intently, but it did not repeat. Just a neighborhood child playing in a nearby yard, I told myself. Nothing more. Yet as I continued my walk home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of eyes watching from shadows that seemed too deep for the still bright evening. At the corner, I glanced back at the vacant lot one last time. For just an instant, so briefly I might have imagined it, I saw a tall figure standing in the center of the empty space, his form oddly elongated against the darkening sky. In his hand, something glinted with a dull metallic sheen. Then a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the lot, and there was nothing there but bare earth and the gathering night. I hurried home, locking my door with uncharacteristic care. In my study, I placed the wooden doll beside Margaret's diary on my bookshelf, arranging them so the doll appeared to be guarding the leather-bound volume. It was a fanciful gesture, one I would have scoffed at before my encounter with 23 Elkin Street. That night, I dreamed of a house, not the narrow brownstone with its hidden room and terrible cellar, but a different place entirely. A modern apartment building, rising on the site where the Caldwell home had stood. In my dream, new tenants moved in, hanging pictures on freshly painted walls, unaware of what had existed before. And in the walls, something stirred, something that had not been destroyed with the house, something that had merely been waiting. As the dream faded, I heard a familiar voice whispering, "The house keeps what belongs to it." I awoke with a start, cold sweat soaking my sheets despite the warm spring night. Reaching for the light, I tried to dismiss the dream as nothing more than my subconscious processing recent events. But a nagging doubt remained, an insidious question that would not be silenced. What if the house was never the prison at all? What if it had merely been a vessel for something older, something that remained in the earth beneath it, waiting for new walls to inhabit? The next morning, I called the city planning office. The clerk who answered confirmed what Mrs. Abernathy had told me. The lot was to become a small park, with benches and flower beds. No new structures would be built there. Relief washed over me, though I couldn't fully articulate why it mattered so much. "That's good," I said. "That's as it should be." Actually, the clerk added, there was some discussion about putting up a small gazebo, but the foundation surveys showed the ground is unstable for any structure. Weird, considering the row houses on either side are perfectly sound. I thanked her and hung up, a chill running through me despite the warm spring sunlight streaming through my window. The ground was unstable. The earth itself rejected any attempt to build there again. Or perhaps something beneath the earth did. Over the following months, I watched as the vacant lot was transformed into a tiny green space. Grass was planted, flower beds established, benches installed along a winding path. Children played there during the day, couples strolled through in the evenings, elderly neighbors sat reading in the sunshine. Yet I noticed that as dusk fell, the park emptied quickly. No one lingered after dark, though none could say exactly why they felt compelled to leave. Dogs pulled at their leashes when walked nearby, whining and refusing to enter the neatly maintained space. And occasionally, very occasionally, passers-by reported hearing sounds that couldn't be explained, a woman's soft weeping, children's laughter, or most disturbing of all, the heavy footsteps of someone pacing back and forth across ground where no footprints could be found. I never told anyone what I knew, what I had seen. Mrs. Abernathy was right. With time, the sharp edges of memory dulled. The certainty of my experiences faded, replaced by the more comfortable possibility that stress and suggestion had played their parts in what I perceived. Yet I keep Margaret's diary and the wooden doll. Sometimes, late at night, I take them out and remind myself that some stories don't end when the last page is turned, that some echoes continue long after the original sound has died away. And I never visit the park after sunset. Some places, I believe, should be left to their ghosts when darkness falls. Some memories belong to the night, to be witnessed only by those who live them. For the Caldwell family, I hope there is peace at last. For Theodore, well, every prison needs its warden. Perhaps in keeping him bound to that small plot of land, in giving him an eternity to contemplate his crimes, a certain justice has been served. As for me, I've learned that the walls we build, whether of brick and mortar or of silence and denial, never truly keep our demons contained. They merely await the inevitable moment when those walls crumble, releasing whatever waits behind them into the light of day. And sometimes, just sometimes, that light is the only exorcism needed. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.